She had nothing left. No money, no town that would take her in, no name that didn't make people cross the street. And in her arms, a baby girl, barely breathing, turning blue in the cold. The man who was supposed to protect them had gambled away every cent, every acre, every ounce of their dignity, and then had the nerve to die and leave her holding the wreckage. 3 towns had already turned her away. The last one didn't even open the door. She sat down in the snow because her legs simply stopped working. If this was the end, she thought, at least the baby wouldn't remember it. And then, hoofbeats. If you've ever been told you were too broken to deserve a second chance, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button and follow Evelyn's journey all the way to the end. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see just how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The last thing Evelyn Mercer remembered clearly before the cold took her thinking was the sound her boots made in the snow. Not a crunch, more like a whisper, like the ground itself was too tired to make a proper noise about being walked on. She'd been making that sound for 4 hours, ever since the wagon driver from Caldwell Creek had pulled his horses to a stop at the fork in the road, pointed east, and said, "That direction, and don't come back through my town." She hadn't argued. What was there to argue? He had a rifle across his lap and the look of a man who had already made his decision 3 minutes before he opened his mouth. So she walked east. The baby, her daughter, Clara, 7 months old and wrapped in the only wool blanket Evelyn still owned, had stopped crying around the 2nd hour. That scared Evelyn more than the crying had. Crying meant alive. Silence meant something else, something she couldn't name out loud or she would fall apart completely, and she couldn't afford to fall apart yet. Not yet. She talked to Clara while she walked, told her about the spring, about how the mud would smell when it finally thawed, about the sound of creek water moving fast after the ice broke. She'd grown up near a creek in Missouri, and she still thought about that sound sometimes. The particular way fast water talked to itself over smooth rocks, like it was in a conversation nobody else could follow. "We're going to find a creek," she said, her voice coming out rougher than she intended, scraped raw from the cold. "A good one, with rocks you can skip. You're going to like it." Clara didn't answer, but she was still breathing. Evelyn could feel it, small, shallow puffs of warmth against her collarbone. As long as that kept happening, Evelyn kept moving. She had 47 cents. She knew because she'd counted it twice while waiting outside the general store in Caldwell Creek, hoping someone inside would take pity and sell her something. Flour, salt, anything. And instead, the store owner's wife had come out and told her, quietly but firmly, that they didn't serve her kind here, and that she ought to move along before her husband came back from the back room and made things less polite. Her kind. Evelyn still wasn't entirely sure what that meant. A widow? A woman alone? Someone from outside the territory? Or just someone who'd made the mistake of arriving in a town where her husband's reputation had apparently traveled ahead of her, turning every door into a wall before she even knocked. Thomas Mercer had been dead for 11 weeks. She hadn't grieved him, and that fact sat in her chest like a stone she couldn't spit out and couldn't swallow. She'd stood at his grave in the mud outside Harrisville, and she'd waited for the grief to come. The proper kind, the shaking kind, the kind women were supposed to have for their husbands. And instead, all she'd felt was a deep, animal exhaustion, and underneath it, something shameful. Relief. The particular quiet of a room after a loud sound finally stops. Thomas had been the loud sound. She pushed that thought away now because it didn't help her move faster, and moving faster was the only plan she had. The snow had started again around noon. Not heavy, just mean, the kind that came in sideways and found the gaps in your clothing, no matter how tight you pulled things. She had Clara tucked inside her coat as much as possible, one arm curled around the baby's back, the other arm out for balance on the uneven ground. Her feet had stopped hurting around the 3rd hour, which she knew was bad. Pain was a sign. No pain meant the cold had decided to stop bothering with signs. She came around a bend in the road, and the wind hit her full in the face. She stopped. Not because she wanted to, her legs just stopped, like a watch winding down. She stood there for a moment with the wind pushing at her, and then her knees buckled and she sat down in the snow, and the sitting down felt so much better than standing that she almost laughed. Just a minute, she told herself. Just a minute, and then you get up. She looked down at Clara's face, the tiny pale face barely visible in the folds of the blanket. And Clara's eyes were open. Dark brown eyes, wide and calm, looking up at her mother with an expression that didn't know enough about the world yet to be afraid. That was what broke Evelyn. Not the cold, not the hunger. And she was hungry enough now that her stomach had given up cramping and gone quiet, which was its own kind of alarm. Not the 47 cents, or the 3 towns, or the wagon driver with his rifle. It was those calm brown eyes looking up at her, trusting her completely, with no idea at all that trust might be misplaced. I don't know how to save you, Evelyn thought. And then, because there was no one to hear it, I don't know if I can. She pulled Clara tighter and bent over her, curving her body around the baby like a shell, like she could make herself into something warmer than she was. And the snow came down and the wind moved through the trees, and she couldn't feel her feet anymore, and she closed her eyes. She didn't pray. She hadn't prayed since Harrisville, and before that she'd been praying for years, and Thomas Mercer kept happening anyway. So she'd reached a private arrangement with the universe where she stopped asking for things, and it stopped pretending it was listening. She just waited. The hoofbeats came so gradually she thought at first she was imagining them. A sound her frozen mind had invented because it wanted there to be something. But they got louder. A single horse, moving at a careful pace, the creak of saddle leather and the soft blow of breath in cold air. And then they stopped. She didn't open her eyes right away. She wasn't sure she could. "Ma'am." A man's voice. Low, not unkind. Cautious the way a person gets cautious when they find something in the road they weren't expecting. She opened her eyes. He was on a dark bay horse, a big animal that stood perfectly still despite the wind. The man himself was tall. She could tell even from the ground, with a hat pulled low and a canvas coat that had seen a lot of weather. He was looking down at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not pity exactly. More like recognition, which was stranger. "You got a baby there," he said. It wasn't a question, but she answered it anyway. "Yes." He got down off the horse in one motion, and he crouched down in front of her at a distance that wasn't too close. The distance of a man who understood that a woman alone on the ground in the snow had reasons to be frightened of strange men crouching near her. She could see his face now. Older than she'd thought. Somewhere past 40, with a jaw that looked like it had been clenched for years, and lines around his eyes that weren't from smiling. There was a scar along his left cheekbone, old and pale, the kind you stop noticing on your own face after a while. "How long you been sitting here?" "I don't know." "A few minutes?" He looked at Clara. Something moved across his face quickly, something that tightened and then got locked back down behind his eyes. "Where are you going?" "East." She said it, and then she heard how hollow it sounded, because east was a direction, not a destination. East was what you said when you didn't have an answer. He seemed to understand that. He didn't push it. "There's nothing east of here for 20 miles except my ranch, and then a lot of empty," he said. "It's going to be dark in 2 hours." She didn't say anything. "You got family somewhere?" he asked. "No." "Husband?" She looked at him steadily. "He died 11 weeks ago." He absorbed that, looked back at Clara, looked at Evelyn's boots, which were wrong for this weather, town boots, not trail boots, and at her coat, which wasn't enough for what the sky was doing. He stood up, and for a terrible moment she thought he was getting back on the horse. Instead he said, "Can you stand?" She tried. She made it halfway up and her right leg gave out. The leg that had been bearing more weight because the left boot had a loose sole that let in the wet. And he caught her arm, not grabbing, just steadying, and she gripped his coat sleeve to stay upright and then let go as fast as she could. "Thank you." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "My name's Colton Hayes," he said. "I've got a ranch 2 miles from here. It's warm. There's food." He paused. I'm not asking you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm just telling you what's there." She looked at him. She'd been looked at a certain way by men her whole adult life, and she knew the shape of it. And what she saw on this man's face wasn't that. What she saw was something more uncomfortable, something honest, which was sometimes harder to trust than dishonesty, because at least dishonesty you could name. "Why?" she asked. He blinked, like it was a question he hadn't expected. "Because it's cold," he said. "And you've got a baby." It wasn't an eloquent answer. That was maybe why she believed it. "I'm Evelyn Mercer," she said. "This is Clara." He nodded once, formal, like they were being introduced at a normal place under normal circumstances. "Mrs. Mercer." She almost corrected him on the Mrs. part. She'd been trying to get used to not being a Mrs. anymore. And then she stopped because she realized she was thinking about grammar while standing in the snow with numb feet and a half-frozen baby. And that was either the most ridiculous thing imaginable or proof that her brain was still working, and either way it seemed like a sign to get moving. "All right, Mr. Hayes," she said, "show me." He helped her onto the horse without making a production of it, just offered his hand, she took it, and she was up with Clara held carefully against her chest. He walked the horse rather than riding, staying at its head, which meant they moved slower, but she didn't have to manage the animal while holding an infant, and she noticed that he'd made that choice without being asked. She didn't know what to make of Colton Hayes yet. She didn't try. Making sense of things could wait until she was warm. The ranch came into view just as the last pale light was fading from the sky. A long, low house with lamplight in 2 windows, and behind it a barn that was bigger than the house, and fences running off into the dark. It was not a pretty place. It had the look of somewhere that had been built by someone who cared more about function than appearance, all right angles and solid construction and nothing extra anywhere. But the lamps were lit, and there was smoke coming from the chimney, and to Evelyn Mercer those 2 facts were the most beautiful things she had seen in months. He got her down from the horse, and she managed the step down without her leg giving out this time. He led the horse toward the barn, paused, looked back at her. "Doors unlocked?" he said. "Go on in. Wood's already in the stove. Should just need the damper opened if it's died down." You don't have anyone else here? Any family?" Something shifted in his face again, that same quick locking down she'd seen before. "No," he said. "No family." He went to see to the horse, and she went inside. The front room was spare, a table, 2 chairs, a bench along one wall, a coat rack with 1 coat on it, a stove that had burned down to coals but not out. She found the damper by feel more than sight and adjusted it, and in a few minutes the fire was talking again, the metal ticking as it expanded. She sat in one of the chairs with Clara and unwrapped the blanket with hands that were shaking now, which was actually a good sign. Shaking meant her body was still fighting for warmth. And she checked Clara all over the way she'd been checking her every hour, counting fingers, feeling the warmth of her skin, watching the rise and fall of her chest. "You're okay," she whispered. "You're okay, you're okay, you're okay." The repetition helped. She wasn't sure who she was saying it to anymore. Colton came in from the barn about 20 minutes later, stomping snow off his boots at the door, and he stopped when he saw her. Sitting in the chair, Clara asleep in her arms now, both of them lit by the stove's orange light. And his face did something complicated that he sorted out before she could read it properly. "You hungry?" he asked. "Yes." It was the first honest single-word answer she'd given to any stranger in 11 weeks. It came out of her before she could think about whether it was the smart thing to say, and she felt briefly naked because of it. He moved to the small adjoining kitchen without ceremony, and she heard him working, the clank of a pan, the knock of wood, and then after a while the smell of something cooking that made her stomach seize up and start cramping again with a ferocity that made her press her free hand against her midsection. He brought her a bowl of salt pork and beans with a thick slice of bread balanced on the rim and a tin cup of something hot. She looked at the food, and her throat did something embarrassing. "Don't apologize," he said roughly, not unkind. "Just eat." She looked up at him. "I wasn't going to apologize," she said. A pause. "All right then." She ate. He sat in the other chair with his own bowl, and for a while there was just the sound of the fire and the wind outside and the small animal sounds of Clara sleeping. "The Towns," he said eventually, without looking at her. "They turned you away?" "Yes." "Why?" She put her spoon down and looked at him directly. She had decided somewhere between the road and this chair that she was done with softening things, because softening things hadn't helped her, and it hadn't changed what was true. "My husband was Thomas Mercer," she said. "Maybe you've heard the name." A pause, something in his jaw. "I've heard it." "Then you know what he did." Thomas Mercer had not been a simple bad man. Simple bad men were almost easier. They broke the law. They got caught. There was a process. Thomas had been the kind of bad man who never broke a law that could be proven in a courtroom. He'd cheated at cards in ways that were hard to demonstrate. He'd borrowed money with more confidence than intention. He'd made promises to investors in 3 territories that he'd had no capacity to keep. And when those promises collapsed, people lost land and cattle, and in at least 2 cases more than that. And then he died of a fever before anyone could make him answer for it, which was, in the end, the most Thomas Mercer thing he could possibly have done. Evelyn had been his wife. That was all anyone needed to know about her, apparently. "You didn't do those things," Colton said. It wasn't a question either. "No. But they blamed you anyway." "Some did." She picked her spoon back up. "Some just didn't want the trouble of someone connected to him. Either way, the door closed." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "This territory, people talk. Word travels faster than horses out here, which I've never fully understood, but it's how it is." He looked at her. "They'll know you're here. Some of them will have opinions about it." She met his eyes. "Is that you telling me to leave in the morning?" He held her gaze. His eyes were gray, she noticed, the specific gray of sky right before snow, and they were steady in a way that made her feel like he was choosing each word before he said it. "No," he said. "That's me telling you what's coming so you can make an informed decision about whether to stay." "What's the condition?" she asked. "You said on the road, a chance to start over, but with a condition. What is it?" He looked slightly caught off guard, which she suspected didn't happen to him often. "I said that?" Not in those words, but that was the shape of it. He set his bowl down on the floor next to his chair and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, staring at the middle distance. "I need someone to help manage the house," he said. "I've been running this place alone for 3 years, and the house part is not something I do well. The ranch I can manage. The house has gotten away from me." A pause. "In exchange, you'd have a room, food, safety." Another pause, longer. "I'm not talking about, I mean this as straight work. Nothing else." 3 years, she said. He looked at her. "You said 3 years alone. What happened 3 years ago?" The fire ticked. Outside, the wind moved against the walls. "My wife died," he said. "And my son." The words landed in the room with a weight that changed the air. Evelyn looked at this man, at the jaw that had been clenched for years, at the lines that weren't from smiling, at the scar on his cheekbone that he'd stopped noticing, and she understood suddenly and completely why she hadn't seen pity on his face when he'd found her on the road. She'd seen recognition. "I'm sorry," she said. "So am I," he said. And then after a beat, "About yours too, even if he—" He stopped. "Even if he wasn't worth it?" she finished quietly. He didn't answer that. She hadn't expected him to, but he didn't disagree either. "The condition," he said again, getting back to solid ground, "is trust. I can't have someone under this roof who doesn't trust me, and I can't have someone who I'm watching over my shoulder at. It doesn't work that way. I need to know if you say something, it's true. I need to know if you're in trouble, you'll say so, and you need to know the same from me." She thought about that, about what trust meant coming from the wreckage of Thomas Mercer, who had been charming and persuasive and had always had a reason for everything, right up until the reason stopped working. "I don't know yet if I can trust you," she said honestly. "I don't think you can know that about someone in a night." "No," he agreed. "But can you decide to try?" She looked down at Clara, who was sleeping with her whole being the way babies sleep, completely committed to it, small fists loose, face slack with absolute faith in the arms holding her. "Yes," Evelyn said. "I can decide to try." It wasn't a promise. She wasn't ready to make promises. But it was something true, which was maybe the only currency either of them had right now. And maybe that was enough to start. Colton Hayes stood up, took her bowl in his, and went back to the kitchen without making a ceremony of the moment, which was the right thing to do. Evelyn sat with Clara in the warmth of the fire, listening to the wind outside trying to get in, and felt not safe exactly, not yet, but not finished either. Not finished was, for right now, more than enough. She woke in the night to Clara crying. The room Colton had shown her to was small. A cot, a washstand, a window with frost on the inside of the glass. And for a moment she didn't know where she was, and her hands went to Clara in the dark with the blind speed of a mother's body before her mind had caught up. I've got you, I've got you. Clara settled after a few minutes. Hunger. Evelyn had so little milk left, her body running on so little, but there was enough, and the baby quieted and went back to sleep, and Evelyn lay in the dark with her heart still going fast. From somewhere in the house came a sound, small, barely audible. She lay still and listened. It was Colton. She was almost certain. Moving carefully in the front room, the sound of a man trying not to wake anyone, a chair shifting, the soft clink of a cup. 3 a.m, maybe, and he wasn't sleeping either. She thought about his wife, his son. 3 years of a house with those 2 absences in it, going about your days, feeding the cattle and mending the fences and coming back inside every evening to a silence that had the particular shape of people who weren't there anymore. She thought about the way he'd looked at Clara. She could break this man, she thought, with a clarity that surprised her. Not intentionally, just by being here, just by being a woman with a baby in a house that used to have that and doesn't anymore. It was a responsibility she hadn't asked for and didn't know what to do with. She should think about that, she told herself. She should think carefully, with the part of her that was practical and cautious and had learned to be both of those things the hard way. She thought about it for approximately 4 minutes before exhaustion pulled her back under. Morning came with flat gray light and the sound of Colton already in the barn. The distant rumble of his voice talking to the horses, because apparently he was a man who talked to horses, which she found inexplicably reassuring. She got up, got Clara settled with a folded blanket on the floor in the corner of the kitchen where she could see her, and looked around the kitchen with the particular eye of someone who is cataloging a space rather than admiring it. He hadn't been wrong about the house getting away from him. The kitchen was functional but grim. Things put away in approximately the right places but without any particular system. A film of grease on the stovetop that had been there long enough to become almost geological. A curtain over the kitchen window that had probably been bright once and was now the color of old bone. The pantry held enough. He wasn't starving himself, he just wasn't caring about anything beyond keeping himself functional. And she stood there long enough to understand what 3 years of getting by looked like from the inside. She built the fire up properly because whoever had built it last night had done a serviceable job but not an efficient one, and she started coffee because there were coffee beans and a grinder, and she found a cloth and cleaned the stovetop before she started anything on it because she couldn't cook on a surface that looked like that. She had breakfast most of the way done when he came in from the barn, and he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the stove and then at the clean surface and then at her, and the expression on his face was so briefly unguarded that she looked away to give him a moment with it. You didn't have to. I was awake, she said. Sit down. It's almost ready. He sat down. She put the plate in front of him, eggs, salt pork again, bread, and poured coffee and sat down across from him with her own plate, and Clara made small contented sounds from the corner. They ate in silence for a while. I was thinking, Evelyn said, about the system in the pantry. He looked up. There isn't one, she said, which means you're probably buying things you already have and running out of things you didn't realize you needed. I'd like to reorganize it, if that's all right, and I'll make a list of what's actually needed in town. He looked at her in that careful way he had, the way of a man who was used to thinking before speaking. All right, he said. Also, the curtain in here needs to come down and be washed, or replaced. It's past washing, honestly. I didn't notice it. I know, that's why I'm telling you. Something almost happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the shape of one, like the memory of the habit. Mrs. Mercer, he said, I think you might actually mean to do this. She picked up her coffee cup. I told you I would try, she said. I don't say things I don't mean. He nodded, once, slowly, and went back to his breakfast. Outside the window, the snow had stopped during the night, and the sky had the particular cleaned-out quality of a cold morning after a storm, everything sharp and still and brutally clear. Evelyn watched the light change across the table and thought, this is either the beginning of something or the end of something. She wasn't certain yet which one it was, but she had decided to try, and she was, above everything else, a woman who kept her decisions. That would have to be enough for now. Part 2. A home built against the world. The curtain came down on the third day. Evelyn had been putting it off, not because she'd changed her mind about it, but because taking down a curtain in another person's house felt like a larger act than it looked, and she was still learning where the lines were. But on the third morning, she stood in the kitchen waiting for the coffee to boil and stared at that curtain for the last time and thought, no, enough. And she pulled it down and carried it outside and hung it over the fence post in the cold air. And then she went back inside and the kitchen window was bare and the light came through it differently, cleaner, more honest. And she felt something shift incrementally in the house itself, like a room exhaling. Colton noticed when he came in from the morning feeding. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the bare window for a moment without saying anything. It was past washing, Evelyn said, not looking up from the stove. I know, he said. You told me. He went to the table and sat down, and she heard something in his voice that wasn't disagreement, more like a man adjusting to the fact that things were changing and deciding, consciously, not to fight it. That was how the first weeks went. Small adjustments, small negotiations, most of them unspoken. She reorganized the pantry the way she'd said she would. Pulled everything out, wiped the shelves, put it back in an order that made sense, dry goods together, preserved things on the lower shelf where the temperature stayed more even, the things used daily at the front. She wrote the list of what was needed and left it on the table without comment, and the next time Colton rode into the nearest town, a place called Harlan's Crossing, about 8 miles west, he came back with everything on it. He didn't ask her to go with him to town. She didn't suggest it. They had the same quiet understanding about that without discussing it, which told her something about him. He'd thought about how she might be received, and he'd made a decision to spare her the experience until she was steadier on her feet. She didn't know whether to be grateful for that, or unsettled by how naturally he'd anticipated it. Clara was gaining weight. That was the thing that mattered most to Evelyn in those early weeks, the thing she measured everything else against. The baby had been too light, had been too quiet, and now she was louder, demanding and opinionated in the specific way of infants who have decided the world owes them attention. And the sound of Clara hollering from her blanket on the kitchen floor while Evelyn cooked was improbably one of the most beautiful sounds Evelyn had ever heard. Colton had an opinion about the hollering, not a negative one. That was what surprised her. The first time Clara had really opened up, this was on the 5th day, a sustained and fully committed performance of infant outrage, because her blanket had shifted and one foot had gotten cold. Evelyn had swept her up quickly, glancing toward the front room where Colton was mending tack, bracing for the look that men sometimes got when babies were loud. Instead, he appeared in the kitchen doorway, and he was looking at Clara with an expression Evelyn had learned by now to watch for, that brief unguarded thing that crossed his face and got locked back down before it finished forming. He looked at the baby the way a man looks at a fire when he's been cold for a long time and isn't yet sure he's allowed to stand close to it. She all right? He asked. She's fine. Her foot got cold. Oh. He stood there another moment. She's got a voice on her. She does. That's... He stopped. Started again. My son was like that. Loud. It was the first time he'd said anything about his son beyond the single sentence on that first night. Evelyn held very still, the way you hold still around something that might startle. What was his name? She asked. Daniel. A beat. He was 2 when he... Another stop. He was 2. I'm sorry, Colton. He nodded once and went back to the front room, and she heard the resumption of the methodical sounds of tack mending, and she stood in the kitchen with Clara on her hip and her heart aching for a man who had been carefully not aching for 3 years, and she thought that sometimes the most dangerous thing you could do for a grieving person was simply be alive in their house. The first word from town came on the 12th day. She knew it had happened because of the way Colton came in from his afternoon ride, something tight across his shoulders that hadn't been there in the morning, something deliberate about the way he took off his hat and hung it on the rack. He sat down at the dinner table, and she put the food in front of him and sat across from him and waited. He lasted about 4 minutes. People are talking, he said. I assumed they would be. I ran into Walt Greer at the feed store. Walt runs the feed store and he's on the town council. He wanted to know who the woman was at my ranch. What did you tell him? I told him your husband had died and you needed a place to stay while you got back on your feet. He asked if I knew who your husband was. Evelyn put her fork down. And? I told him I did. Colton looked at her directly. I told him I didn't see how that was relevant. Something in her chest loosened slightly, and she resented that it had been tight in the first place. Resented that she'd been waiting to find out whether he'd defend her, or apologize for her, or quietly suggest that maybe the arrangement wasn't working out after all. How did he take that? She asked. Walt Greer doesn't take things, Colton said. He stores them. He'll bring it up at the next council meeting, and he'll have everyone's opinion organized before the week's out. Will that cause you problems? With the ranch? He picked up his fork. I've had problems with the ranch before. I still have the ranch. It wasn't bravado. His voice was flat and even when he said it, the voice of a man stating a fact. She studied him across the table and thought that Colton Hayes was someone who had learned to absorb a great deal without changing direction, and she wasn't sure yet whether that was strength or stubbornness or some combination of the two that couldn't be separated. I should know, she said, if it gets worse. I don't want to be the last to know about something that's happening because of me. You'll know, he said. I told you the condition. I meant it both ways. She nodded. They finished dinner in the usual silence, which had shifted over 2 weeks from an uncomfortable silence to a working one. The silence of two people who were tired at the same hour for similar reasons and didn't need to fill the air to prove they were present. Clara had fallen asleep in the small wooden crate Colton had lined with a folded horse blanket, which was serving as her bed until Evelyn figured out a better solution. He'd produced the crate on day 2 without being asked, set it by the stove where it was warmest, and said nothing about it, which was perhaps the most purely kind thing anyone had done for her in longer than she wanted to calculate. The crate, she said now, because she'd been meaning to say it. Thank you for thinking of it. He looked at the crate, Clara's small chest rising and falling. It's just a crate, he said. I know what it is, she said. I still mean thank you. He looked slightly uncomfortable in the way of a man who didn't know what to do with direct gratitude, which she was beginning to understand was just his face, the particular arrangement of a person who'd spent 3 years receiving only his own company. You're welcome, he said finally, and she could tell it cost him a small effort. She asked him one evening near the end of the 3rd week about his wife. She almost didn't. It felt like stepping onto ice she hadn't tested, and she had enough of her own weight to manage without borrowing trouble. But they'd been sitting by the stove after dinner, she with the mending, him reading something, a rare comfortable quiet between them. And something about the way he'd turned a page and then not read it for a full minute made her say it. Will you tell me about her? Your wife. He looked up from the unread page. Margaret, he said, after a moment. Was she from this territory? No, Missouri originally. Same as you, actually. He paused. Small world. What was she like? He thought about this with the same deliberateness he brought to everything. Stubborn, he said, not in a bad way, in the way where if she decided something was right, you might as well not bother arguing because she'd already worked it out. She was smarter than me, quicker. A brief pause. She thought this ranch was too far from everything. She was right about that. She came out here anyway because I asked her to, and she never once made me feel bad about the distance, even when it mattered. How did she die? Fever. Same as yours, I heard. He looked at the stove. There wasn't a doctor close enough. By the time I got one, it was... He stopped for a moment. Daniel went 4 days later. Same fever. He was small. He didn't have enough size to fight it. Evelyn set down her mending. I'm sorry doesn't seem like it covers it, she said. It doesn't, he agreed without bitterness. But it's what there is, so I'll take it. She looked at him, this large, deliberate, quietly wrecked man sitting across from her in the firelight, and thought about how grief changed the architecture of a person, how it settled into the bones and reorganized things so that nothing would ever be exactly the shape it was before. She knew something about that herself. Thomas wasn't a good man, she said. not because it was related to anything he'd said, but because it felt necessary to say in this space where they were being honest. I knew that by the end of the first year, maybe earlier, if I'm truthful about it. I stayed because leaving felt impossible, and because I kept thinking I could make it different, which is the kind of thinking that does you no favors. Most people who've never been in that don't understand it, Colton said. No, they think it's simple. Why didn't you just leave? As if leaving is a thing you just do. Is Clara his? Yes. She picked up the mending again. That's the part I can't unknot. She's the best thing in my life, and she's his. And those two facts live in the same place, and I don't know what to do with that except go on. Going on seems like the right answer, he said. It's the only one I've got. The fire crackled. Outside, something, wind or an animal or both, moved past the house, and the walls held against it, and Evelyn thought that there was something to be said for walls that held. Bounce. The gossip reached its first peak on a Tuesday in late January. She knew because a woman came to the ranch. Evelyn was in the yard beating the kitchen rugs over the fence when she heard horses on the road and looked up to see a wagon coming up the track toward the house. A woman was driving it, alone, which was unusual, and she pulled the horses to a stop at the yard fence and sat there looking at Evelyn with an expression that took Evelyn a moment to place. Pity, but not the soft kind, the armored kind, worn by people who wanted to help on their own terms. You're the widow, the woman said. Evelyn lowered the rug beater. I'm Evelyn Mercer. Can I help you? I'm Ruth Greer, Walt's wife. She said it like a title. I heard about your situation, and I wanted to come speak to you woman to woman. All right. Ruth Greer was somewhere in her 50s, well-fed and well-dressed by local standards, with the bearing of a woman who had run her household and her husband's opinion for so long that she'd stopped distinguishing between the two. She looked at Evelyn the way you look at a problem you've already decided how to solve. It's not a proper arrangement, Ruth said. I'm sure you know that. A woman alone with a man who isn't her husband. The talk it causes, the questions it raises. I'm not saying anything about your character, mind you. You're implying something about it, Evelyn said evenly. Ruth blinked, slightly thrown. I'm saying there are decent women in Harlan's Crossing who could take you in. Find you a place to work that doesn't what? That doesn't put Colton Hayes in a difficult position. Ruth's voice went gentler, more surgical. He lost his wife and boy, you know. This whole territory knew Margaret Hayes. People loved her. And now to see him with... She caught herself. With a woman whose husband left a great deal of damage behind him. You can understand how it looks. Evelyn stood in the cold yard and felt something she recognized. The specific cold of being told, in the most civilized possible tone, that you were a problem to be managed. Mr. Hayes made me an offer of work in a room, she said. I accepted. What it looks like to Harlan's Crossing is not something I can control. You could make it easier on him by Mrs. Greer. Evelyn's voice was quiet, and she kept it that way. I respect that you came out here to say this in person rather than just sending the rumor. That's more than most people would do. But I'm not going to leave because the town has decided what my presence means. If Mr. Hayes asks me to leave, I'll go. He hasn't. Ruth Greer looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in her expression. Not softening exactly, but an adjustment. The look of a woman recalibrating. You've got spine, Ruth said. I'll give you that. I've had to, Evelyn said. Ruth picked up her reins. The talk won't stop, she said. It wasn't a threat. It sounded almost like a warning from someone who'd lived in the territory long enough to know how these things ran. I know, Evelyn said. It never does. Ruth drove back down the track, and Evelyn stood watching the wagon go, and then she picked up the rug beater and finished what she'd been doing. She told Colton about it at dinner. She told it plain, without dramatizing it, because he'd asked to know about these things, and she'd said she would tell him, and she kept her word. He listened without interrupting, the way he listened to most things, fully, with the specific quality of someone who was actually taking in what you said rather than preparing their response while you spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Walt Greer has a long reach in this county, he said. He's got the feed store, he's on the council, and he's friendly with Judge Anson, who's a man who considers himself the last word on proper conduct in the territory. Is that a problem for the ranch? It could be. There are supply agreements, water rights questions that come up every spring, things where having the council sympathetic helps. He looked at her. I'm not telling you that to make you feel responsible. I'm telling you because you asked to know everything. I asked to know everything, she confirmed. So what do you want to do? He met her eyes. I want to have dinner and go check on the east fence before dark because it's been worrying me, he said, and I want you to stay. Something about the directness of it, the complete lack of hedging, went through her like the heat of the stove went through a cold room. All right, she said. All right, he said back, and they finished dinner, and he went to check the fence, and she washed the dishes, and thought about a man who said what he meant without ceremony, and how rare a thing that was, and how long she'd gone without it. February brought harder cold and the beginning of something she hadn't anticipated. It happened slowly, which was maybe why she didn't notice it at first. It wasn't a moment. It was a series of small moments, the way most true things accumulate. It was the morning he came in from the barn with a cut on his hand from a wire, and she cleaned it without being asked, and he held his hand steady and didn't make a thing of it. It was the evening she sat down at the table after getting Clara down for the night and let her head drop into her hands, just for a moment, just the weight of everything. And he didn't say anything, but he put a cup of coffee next to her elbow and went back to what he was doing, and that somehow was more sustaining than any offered comfort would have been. It was the afternoon she heard him in the barn talking to a horse, really talking, not just murmuring, an actual one-sided conversation about the ice on the water trough and how it was nobody's fault and spring was coming. And she stood outside the barn door and pressed her lips together and felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. The particular warmth of caring about a person, not needing them, not depending on them, just caring what happened to them, caring that they were all right. She went back inside before he came out. She wasn't ready to examine that feeling too closely. She filed it away in the part of herself she hadn't been using, and went back to the bread she'd been making and let the rhythm of the work carry her past it. Clara, meanwhile, had developed a specific attachment to Colton. Evelyn noticed it first around week 4, the way Clara tracked him across the room when he moved, the way her arms started to reach, which was new, that reaching, and it was reaching toward him specifically. Evelyn watched it with an emotion she couldn't completely name, something threaded through with warmth and something else, something protective, something cautious about what it meant for a baby to begin to trust a person. The first time he picked Clara up, it was because Evelyn had both hands covered in bread dough, and Clara was building toward a full protest about her situation, and Colton, who had come in for a drink of water, simply walked to her crate, looked at her for a moment as though asking permission, and lifted her up with both hands in the careful way of someone who had done this before and remembered exactly how. Clara looked up at him with enormous dark eyes. He looked down at her. Evelyn watched them, her hands still in the dough, and didn't breathe. "Hey," he said quietly to Clara. "Hey now." Clara grabbed his finger, and Colton Hayes stood in the middle of the kitchen holding a baby and looking at her face with an expression so undefended, so completely unguarded, that Evelyn had to look away, because it felt like seeing something too private, like finding someone's journal open and realizing you're reading a page they never meant to show anyone. "She's got a grip on her," he said, his voice slightly different than usual. Rougher, somehow. "She does," Evelyn said to her bread dough. He stood there another minute, and then Evelyn's hands were clean enough, and she reached for Clara, and he handed her over with the care of someone returning something valuable, and she thought, and then would not think again until later, much later, this is going to be complicated. The second wave from town hit the ranch on a Friday at the end of February. This time it wasn't a wagon. This time it was Walt Greer himself, in a good coat, on a good horse, riding up the track with the composed certainty of a man who had decided something and was arriving to deliver the decision. Colton was in the yard when he arrived. Evelyn was inside, but she'd heard the horse and she was standing at the kitchen window where she could see without being seen, and she watched Walt Greer climb down with the ease of a man who'd never had to worry about being unwelcome anywhere. Colton, Walt said. Got a minute? What do you need, Walt? I'll say this plainly because that's how we do things. Walt put his hands on the fence rail. The council had a discussion about the woman you've got staying here. She has a name. Mrs. Mercer. Yes. Walt's tone didn't change. Thomas Mercer cost people in this territory a significant amount. Money, land, trust. The name carries weight, Colton, not the good kind. She's not Thomas Mercer. No. But she's his widow, and she's in your house, and people are talking about it in ways that aren't charitable to either of you, and more to the point, in ways that have started reaching the ears of people whose opinion matters for things you care about. The spring water rights hearing is in 6 weeks. Evelyn watched Colton's shoulders through the window, watched them not change. Are you threatening the water rights? Colton asked. His voice was even. I'm telling you the landscape, Walt said. I'm telling you that Judge Anson is a man of particular convictions about propriety, and that having a woman of uncertain reputation under your roof is not going to help your position at that hearing. Uncertain reputation, Colton repeated. I'm not the one making the characterization. I'm telling you it exists. And what do you want me to do about it, Walt? Walt Greer looked at him across the fence rail with the expression of a man delivering medicine he was sure was necessary. Send her on. Find her something in town if you want. Ruth could probably arrange something, but the arrangement you have here is causing talk that's spreading further than Harlan's Crossing, and it's not going to improve on its own. Silence. Evelyn held very still at the window. I appreciate you coming yourself, Colton said finally, rather than just letting it run. I've known you a long time, Walt said. I'm trying to help you. I know you think you are. Colton straightened from where he'd been leaning on the fence and looked at Walt Greer with gray eyes that held the same quality Evelyn had noticed the first night. Complete steadiness. Nothing moving underneath that he hadn't decided to move. She stays, Walt. You can tell the council that. You can tell Judge Anson if you want to. She stays because she's got a child and nowhere to go, and she's working and she's doing nothing wrong. And I'm not in the habit of putting people out in the cold because it makes my life more convenient. Walt absorbed this. You understand what you're risking. I understand what you're describing, Colton said. That's not the same thing. Walt Greer nodded slowly, put his hat back on, and got back on his horse. He looked down at Colton from the saddle with something that might have been respect and might have been pity. The two looked similar sometimes from a distance. You always were stubborn, Walt said. Margaret used to say that too, Colton said. She didn't mean it as a compliment either. Something passed across Walt Greer's face. Grief by proximity. The look of a man who had known Margaret Hayes and still felt the absence. He nodded once and rode back down the track. Colton stood in the yard until the sound of hooves faded. Then he came inside and Evelyn was sitting at the table because she hadn't wanted to still be at the window when he came in, and he looked at her and he could tell by her face that she'd heard it, and she could tell by his that he knew she had. You didn't have to do that, she said. I know. The water rights are my problem to manage. He went to the stove and poured himself coffee and stood with his back to her for a moment. I meant what I said to Walt. I need you to know that. It wasn't posturing. I know, she said quietly. That's what scared me about it. He turned around and looked at her across the kitchen. This man who had ridden into a frozen road and picked up a stranger and brought her home and then stood in his yard and told the most powerful man in the county that she was staying. And she understood in that moment that something had quietly shifted between them in the past weeks. The way ice shifts in early spring, the surface holding but the structure underneath already fundamentally different. She wasn't sure what to do with that. So she did what she'd learned to do. She filed it away and stood up and went to check on Clara and let the rest of the afternoon come in at its own pace. But that night, lying in her small room with the frost on the inside of the window and Clara breathing in the darkness beside her, she thought about a man standing in a cold yard saying she stays to someone who had the power to cost him something real. She thought about that for a long time before sleep came. And when sleep did come, it came easier than it had in months. Not because anything was resolved, but because for the first time since Thomas Mercer's grave, she was in a place where someone had chosen to fight for her right to exist in it. That was not nothing. That was, in the accounting of her life as it had been, something very close to everything. Part 3. The storm that changes everything. The water rights hearing came and went in the first week of March, and Colton won it. Barely, and not without cost. He came home from Harlan's Crossing that evening later than expected, and Evelyn knew from the way he unsaddled his horse that it hadn't gone cleanly. She'd learned to read him in the small physical vocabulary he allowed himself, the set of his shoulders, the pace of his movements, whether he talked to the horse or not. That evening, he didn't talk to the horse, which told her most of what she needed to know before he came inside. "You got the rights," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." He hung his coat and sat down. "Judge Anson ruled in my favor. Walt abstained from the council vote, that was his way of not being against me while not being for me either. 2 of the other council members voted no." "Who?" "Doesn't matter." "Colton." He looked at her. "Pete Harlan and Boyd Sutter. Pete owns the mill. Boyd runs the livery." She absorbed that. Pete Harlan was the reason the town was called Harlan's Crossing. His family had been there since before there was a town, which meant his opinion carried a weight that had nothing to do with whether it was right. Boyd Sutter she'd seen once from a distance, a broad, red-faced man who'd looked at her across the street with a particular expression she'd filed away under trouble, future tense. "They voted no because of me," she said. "They voted no because they've decided who you are based on who Thomas was, and because Walt's position made it safe enough to do it." He picked up his coffee cup and found it empty and set it back down. "The hearing's done. I've got the water rights. That part's over." "But it's not over," she said. He didn't answer that, which was its own answer. She got up and poured his coffee and sat back down, and they stayed at the table in the working silence that had become the native atmosphere of their evenings. And outside, the wind was picking up in a way that had a different quality than the usual cold. Something building, something gathering itself. She'd noticed the sky that afternoon while hanging washing, the particular color of it, the way the clouds were moving. She'd grown up in Missouri near enough to hard weather to know what that color meant. "Storm's coming," she said. "I know. Tomorrow, maybe the day after." He looked toward the window. "I need to get the cattle moved to the south pasture before it hits. Better shelter there." "How bad?" "Hard to say. Could be a week's worth." Clara made a sound from the front room, a small, questioning sound, the particular noise she made when she was waking up from a nap and wasn't yet committed to being awake. Evelyn listened, and the sound settled back into quiet. "She's been warm today," Evelyn said. The words came out carefully, because she'd been watching it all afternoon and telling herself it was nothing. The slight flush on Clara's face, the way she'd been less interested in eating, the small sounds she made that were different from her usual sounds. Colton looked at her. "How warm?" "I don't know exactly. I don't have a thermometer." She kept her voice level. "It might be nothing. Babies run warm sometimes." "Does she seem sick to you?" The question landed with precision because it cut through the things she'd been doing, the managing, the measured language, and asked her directly what her gut said. "I don't know," she said, which was honest. "I'm watching her." He nodded and didn't push it, and they went to bed, and Evelyn lay awake with the wind rising outside and Clara asleep beside her, and that small wrongness she couldn't name turning over and over in the back of her mind like a stone she couldn't stop touching. By morning, Clara was sick. Not alarmingly, not yet. A low fever, a rattling quality to her breathing when she cried. Eyes that were slightly glassy in a way that could mean many things, or only one thing. Evelyn sat with her through the early hours, nursing her when she'd take it and walking her when she wouldn't, and she told herself all the things mothers tell themselves. Babies get fevers, fevers break, this is ordinary, you're being afraid of something that hasn't happened yet. But she also thought about Thomas's death, which had started with 3 days of, "He seems a little warm," before it became something that couldn't be managed. And she thought about what Colton had said about his son. He was small, he didn't have enough size to fight it. And Clara was small. Clara had been too small to begin with. She told Colton at breakfast. She put it plainly. "She's worse this morning. The breathing bothers me." He looked at Clara, who was in her crate by the stove, awake but not herself, staring at the ceiling with the vague, unfocused look of a sick child. There's a doctor in Harlan's Crossing, he said. Weston. He's adequate and not exceptional, but adequate. Can he come out here? In this weather, maybe. Maybe not. He looked out the window. The storm he'd predicted had arrived in the night. Not its full force yet, but the advance of it, heavy gray sky and wind that moved things, and cold that had dropped another 10 degrees since the day before. I can ride in and ask him. In this? It's not. He paused, reconsidered. It's not its worst yet. I've ridden worse. You'd have to bring him back out here through it. Or I bring medicine back. Weston will know what she needs if I describe the symptoms. He's done it before for people who couldn't get in. Evelyn looked at Clara, the small chest rising and falling with that slight rattle underneath each breath. She's 8 months old, Colton. I know how old she is, he said quietly. I'm not asking you to risk yourself. I need you to tell me honestly whether it's possible to get there and back. He looked at the window again, at the sky making its slow, terrible preparations. I can get there, he said. Getting back depends on how fast this moves. Then don't go. We'll watch her, and if she... Evelyn. He said her name the way he said everything, without decoration. I'm going. She looked at him. He was already standing, already moving with the particular purpose of a man who had made a decision and was now simply executing it. She recognized that quality in him, the way he moved through a choice once it was made without revisiting it, and she had learned in the past weeks that arguing with it was like arguing with weather. Be careful, she said. The words felt inadequate, and she said them anyway. He got his heaviest coat from the rack, the one she'd mended a rip in the lining last week, and his gloves and his hat, and he stopped at the door and looked back at her sitting with Clara at the kitchen table. Keep the fires up, he said. Both of them. And don't open the door unless it's me. Why? Something moved across his face. Storms bring out the wrong kind of people sometimes. Men who know a ranch is short-handed because the owner rode out. It hadn't occurred to her. She filed it alongside everything else in the growing collection of things this territory had taught her about how precarious ordinary life could be. I'll keep the door locked, she said. He nodded and went out, and she heard the barn, and then hoofbeats moving away, and then just the wind. She talked to Clara all morning, the same way she'd talked to her on the road, about the creek in Missouri, about spring, about things that hadn't happened yet but would. The baby was too sick to respond properly, but she tracked Evelyn's face when she spoke, those dark eyes following her mother's voice with an animal faith that made Evelyn's chest ache with the specific tenderness of being needed so completely by something so small. The fever climbed through mid-morning, not dramatically, not the sharp rocketing kind that meant one thing, just steady, persistent, a degree at a time in the way Evelyn was measuring it with her lips against Clara's forehead, the old way, the way her own mother had done. She kept the stove burning hot and held Clara against her and walked the front room because movement seemed to help, or at least seemed to help Evelyn, and sometimes that was all you could manage. The storm hit its full force around noon. She heard it before it was fully there, the wind changing pitch, rising through registers until it was a sound that pressed on the walls and found every gap in the logs and came through as a thin, cold breath she could feel on her face, even standing in the middle of the room. The temperature inside dropped perceptibly. She put more wood on both fires, the stove and the front room hearth, and bundled Clara in every blanket she had and sat down with her in the chair closest to the stove and settled in to wait. She thought about Colton on that road. She thought about the 8 miles between the ranch and Harlan's Crossing and what those 8 miles looked like right now. And she clamped down on the thought because it didn't help anyone. He was a man who knew this land. He'd ridden it in every condition. He was not a man who miscalculated his own capabilities. She told herself that until she believed it, which took approximately 90 minutes. Clara slept fitfully, waking every half hour or so with that rattling cry, and each time Evelyn brought her back down with her voice and her warmth and her sheer will to keep the child in the world. And between those intervals, she watched the window where the snow was hitting the glass hard enough to sound like thrown sand. The afternoon got dark early the way it does in storms, the light just draining away without the usual procession of colors. Evelyn lit the lamp in the kitchen and the one in the front room and sat in the overlap of their light and tried not to count hours. At some point, she thought it was around 4 in the afternoon but couldn't be certain. She heard something outside that was different from the wind, a sound that stopped and then happened again. She went to the window but could see nothing through the snow, which was moving horizontally now in thick, fast curtains. She went to the door and stood with her hand on the bolt. Colton? Nothing. Wind. She waited. Then fainter, a sound that might have been a voice. She unbolted the door and opened it 3 inches against the wind's resistance, and the cold hit her like a hand. Colton? Here. She hauled the door open. He came in with the storm behind him, and she put her weight against the door to get it closed, and the wind fought her for it for a moment before she won. She turned around, and he was standing in the front room with ice in his beard, and his coat so stiff with cold that it looked like it had been dipped in water and frozen, which was essentially what had happened. The horse, he said immediately. I need to. The horse is at the post. I need to. Sit down first. Evelyn, 30 seconds. Sit down. He sat. She pulled his coat off him. It was so cold it felt almost brittle, and she could feel the cold coming off him in waves, and his hands, when she pulled the gloves off, were white in the fingers, in a way that made her stomach drop. Your hands, she said. They're all right. I've had worse. The horse. I'll hold it open for you, and you go put the horse up. She was already moving. There's warm water on the stove when you come back. He went back out. She held the door against the wind, and he disappeared into the white, and she stood there with the storm trying to come in around her, and she was shaking, she noticed. Not from cold, from the specific aftermath of several hours of fear that had just been released all at once. He was back in 10 minutes. She got the door closed again, and he stood in the front room, and she brought warm water in a bowl and put his hands in it without asking, and he sat with his hands in the water and looked at Clara in her crate with an expression so nakedly relieved to see her that Evelyn had to look away again for the second time that week. How is she? Worse than this morning. Better than I was afraid of. Evelyn paused. Did you get it? The medicine? He reached into his coat. The coat she'd already hung already started drying near the stove, and from the inside pocket he produced a small bottle, which he must have kept inside his coat against his body, the whole ride back to keep it from freezing. Weston said 2 drops in water 3 times a day. It's a tincture. He makes it himself, uses it for fever and lung colds in children. He looked at the bottle. He wanted to come himself. He's 64, and he wanted to get on a horse in a blizzard. I hope you told him no. I told him I'd bring her in when the storm broke if she wasn't improving. He looked at his hands in the warm water. The white was leaving his fingers. He said she sounds young and otherwise healthy. He said young, otherwise healthy children fight these things if you keep them warm and keep them hydrated. A pause. He said Margaret's boy had a similar thing at 6 months and came through it. The way he said it, Margaret's boy, she understood that Dr. Weston had probably said your boy and Colton had adjusted the language for some private reason. She didn't call attention to it. Thank you, she said, for going out in that. Don't, he said. Don't thank you? Don't make it something I need thanking for. She's a child and she needed medicine. He took his hands out of the water and looked at them, the color coming back, which meant no real damage. I wasn't going to sit here and watch her get sicker because the weather was inconvenient. Evelyn looked at him sitting in the chair with his hair still half frozen and the color only just coming back into his face, and she thought about the 8 miles in the blizzard and the small bottle he'd kept inside his coat. And she thought, this is who this man is, not the man he was trying to be or the man the town had decided he should remain, just this. This was who he was. She gave Clara the first dose that evening, 2 drops in a small spoon of warm water, and the baby made a face that was so purely offended that Evelyn laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that surprised you. And Colton, sitting across the room, looked up at the sound of it with an expression she couldn't name. What? She said. Nothing, he said. I haven't heard you laugh before. She thought about that. I haven't had much occasion. No, he said. I suppose not. Claire improved through the night. Slowly, incrementally, the way recovery happens in small children. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, the fever breaking a little and then returning a little less, the breathing clearing degree by degree. Evelyn slept in the chair beside the crate, waking at every sound. And Colton, at some point in the deep hours, moved his own chair from the front room to the doorway of the kitchen, so he was sitting 10 feet away from her, and she found him there in the gray early morning when she woke from a heavier sleep, sitting upright in his chair with his chin on his chest, asleep. She looked at him for a moment. Then she got up quietly and built the fires up and started coffee and checked Clara's forehead. And Clara's forehead was cooler than it had been in 2 days. Evelyn stood in the kitchen with her hand on her daughter's face and her eyes closed, and she allowed herself, for 30 seconds, to feel the full terror of what the past 18 hours had been. She let it run through her in a controlled burn, the fear, the helplessness, the particular agony of watching a baby who trusted you completely and not being sure you could be trusted with something that fragile. And then she let it go, because that was the other thing she'd learned about fear. You had to let it move through, because trying to hold it in place made it permanent. She's better. Colton was awake. She hadn't heard him. Yes, Evelyn said, taking her hand off Clara's forehead. The fever's down. The breathing's easier. He nodded once. He looked, not relieved exactly, because the relief had happened in the night, she suspected, during whichever watch he'd kept in that doorway. He looked like a man who had set something down after carrying it for a while. Coffee's almost ready, she said. All right. They sat down at the kitchen table in the early morning light, the storm still going outside but quieter now, spending itself, and Clara slept in her crate with the particular piece of a fever breaking, and neither of them said much because there wasn't much to say that the night hadn't already said for them. The storm broke on the 3rd day, and on the 4th day Boyd Sutter rode to the ranch with 2 other men Evelyn didn't recognize, and everything that had been building quietly under the surface of things came up hard and fast like water finding a crack. She saw them coming from the kitchen window, and she stood very still for a moment, reading the shape of it. 3 men, not a social call, something in the way they were riding that had an organized quality, a purposefulness. She went to the front room. Colton. He was already at the window. He went outside to meet them, and Evelyn stayed at the window, and she watched Boyd Sutter pull his horse up at the yard fence with the specific confidence of a man who had decided in advance how this was going to go. Hayes, Sutter's voice carried through the glass. Need a word. Having several already, Colton said. What do you want, Boyd? Council took a formal vote yesterday. Sutter reached into his coat and produced a folded paper. Resolution. Regarding the situation at your property. The situation. The woman. Sutter's jaw was set. Council's position is that harboring Thomas Mercer's widow on a property in this territory is a matter of public concern. Given the debts and damage his dealings caused to citizens of this county, her presence is, I'm going to stop you there, Boyd. Colton's voice was even and completely without heat, which was somehow more ominous than anger would have been. That paper doesn't have the force of law. Walt knows that, and you know that. The council doesn't have jurisdiction over who lives on private property. Judge Anson can come talk to me himself if he's got something to say. Colton looked at the 2 men behind Sutter, younger men, one of them she recognized as working at the livery. These your friends or your hired hands? I'm telling you, Sutter said, and his voice had changed, dropped the official tone, gotten personal, that there are people in this territory who are owed money by the Mercer name, people who lost real things, and they are not going to sit quiet while his widow lives comfortable on a ranch and pays no account for what was done. She didn't do those things. She benefited from them. She benefited from them, Colton repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they were structurally sound and finding them not. Her husband cheated people, Boyd. Her husband. She was 19 years old when she married him. She spent 6 years watching him dismantle everything they had, and then she was left with a 7-month-old baby and nothing else. That's what she benefited from. Sutter's face had gone a dark color. You've got an attachment to this woman that's affecting your judgment. My judgment's fine. She's got her hooks in you. That's what people are saying. The shift in Colton's posture was small, but Evelyn caught it. A very slight stillness, the kind of stillness that happens just before a large, deliberate movement. "You're going to want to be careful with the next thing you say," Colton said. "I'm saying what people are saying," Sutter said, but something in his voice had retreated slightly. "I'm saying the town wants her gone and that you've let yourself get off my land." Not loud, just final, the way a door closing is final. Sutter looked at him, at the two men behind him who had the look of men who were reconsidering the morning's plans. Then back at Colton. "You're making enemies," Sutter said. "I've noticed," Colton said. "Get off my land, Boyd. Don't come back without a legal reason." Sutter held the moment for 3 more seconds, long enough to not look like he was retreating, short enough to be retreating. And then he turned his horse and the other two followed him, and Colton stood in the yard until they were down the track and gone. Then he stood in the yard for another minute by himself. Evelyn watched him from the window, and she thought about what Sutter had said. "She's got her hooks in you." And the contempt of it, but also underneath the contempt the thing it was pointing at, the thing the whole town had apparently noticed and turned into something ugly, something they could use. She thought about what that meant. Not about the town, about her. About the fact that she'd been living in this house for 2 months, and something had grown here that she hadn't planted on purpose and didn't know how to tend, and the town had seen it before she'd fully allowed herself to look at it. Colton came back inside. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything about Sutter, or the town, or the paper, or "she's got her hooks in you." "I should go into Harlan's Crossing," she said instead. "Take Clara to see Dr. Weston. Make sure she's fully cleared." "Yes," he said. "I'll drive you." "You don't have to, Evelyn." He looked at her steadily. "I'll drive you." She nodded. They went the next morning, and it was the first time she'd been to Harlan's Crossing, and she was aware of every pair of eyes on the street. And there were eyes, more than she expected, the particular attention of a community that had already decided something about her and was now getting to see her in person for the first time. She kept her chin level and looked straight ahead and held Clara against her shoulder, and Colton drove the wagon with his usual unhurried steadiness, and she thought, let them look. Dr. Weston was a small, precise man who examined Clara with efficient gentleness and pronounced her recovered with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone who'd seen 10,000 fevers and knew what recovery looked like. "Fine child," he said, looking at Clara with what appeared to be genuine appreciation for the quality of her recovery. "Excellent constitution. Whatever you did those first 2 days, it was right." "She had someone go for medicine in the blizzard," Evelyn said. Weston looked at Colton. "Did you?" It didn't seem optional," Colton said. Weston looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who had lived in a community long enough to know what it cost a person to be who they were in front of everyone. "No," he said. "I don't suppose it did." They were on their way back to the wagon when it happened. She didn't see who threw it. She heard the sound first, something hitting the wagon's sideboard. And then she saw it on the ground beside the wheel. A rock. Smooth, river-rounded, the size of a fist. No one on the street moved. No one said anything. But there were faces in the doorways of the feed store, the dry goods, the barber shop, and none of them were looking away. Evelyn stood very still. Colton turned slowly and looked at the street. He looked at each doorway in turn, unhurried, and the men in the doorways found reasons to look elsewhere. He stood in the street, and he was not a man given to demonstrations. She knew that. She'd watched him manage every provocation with that controlled, deliberate stillness. But something had changed in the last 30 seconds, and it was visible on him the way a change in weather is visible in the sky. He looked at her, at Clara, at the rock on the ground, and then something in his face changed in a way she hadn't seen before. "Get in the wagon," he said quietly. "I'll be right there." "Colton, please." She got in. She held Clara against her, and she watched him walk to the middle of the street and stand there with his hands at his sides and speak in a voice that carried without being raised. "I know who this street belongs to," he said. "I know every face here, and I know which ones are looking away right now. I've done business with most of you for 15 years, and I've had no cause to say a cross word about any of you in all that time." A pause. "But I'm going to be clear about something today. The woman in that wagon is under my protection. Her daughter is under my protection. Whoever threw that rock is going to have to look me in the face about it. And if they can't do that, they might want to think about whether what they did says something about her character or their own. Silence. Wind in the street. A horse shifting at the rail. Nobody spoke. Good, Colton said, and he walked back to the wagon and climbed up and took the reins and drove them out of Harlan's Crossing at the same pace he'd driven in. Evelyn didn't say anything for a quarter mile. Then, "You didn't have to do that." Yes, I did," he said. And there was something in his voice now that was different from anything she'd heard from him before. Not anger, but its opposite. A clarity that was almost quiet. The sound of a man who has finished deciding something he's been working on for a long time. She looked at his profile against the cold sky. The jaw that had been clenched for years. The lines that weren't from smiling. "What are you going to do?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Something I should have done a while ago," he said. She waited. He didn't say more, and she didn't push it. And they drove back to the ranch through the cold, clean air of the post-storm afternoon, and Clara fell asleep against Evelyn's chest, and the horses moved steadily on the road, and somewhere in that quiet, Evelyn felt the ground shifting underneath them both. Not destabilizing, but reorganizing, the way ground reorganizes after something frozen in it finally thaws. She held Clara and watched the road ahead, and let the feeling come without pushing it away, for the first time since she'd sat down in the snow at a crossroads 11 weeks ago and waited for whatever happened next. What happened next had turned out to be Colton Hayes. She still didn't know the full shape of what that meant, but she had stopped pretending she didn't know it meant something. Part 4. Standing Together. He didn't say what he was going to do. Not that night, not the next morning. He went about the ranch work the way he always did. Up before light, out to the barn, the methodical rhythm of a man whose days were structured around what needed doing, rather than what he felt like doing. Evelyn watched him from the kitchen window the way she'd been watching him for weeks now, reading him in the small physical language she'd learned, and what she saw was a man carrying something that hadn't been there before. Not heavier, exactly. More like resolved. The particular bearing of someone who has finished an internal argument and come out the other side of it. She didn't push. She'd learned that pushing Colton toward something before he was ready to say it was like trying to hurry the thaw. You could want it all you liked, but the ground moved on its own schedule. What she did instead was take stock of herself, which she'd been avoiding. She sat at the kitchen table after Clara went down for her morning nap, and she put her hands flat on the table, and she made herself look at the things she'd been filing away since February, the things Sutter had named in the ugliest possible way, and that the town had apparently been discussing in slightly less ugly ways for weeks. She had feelings for Colton Hayes, not the desperate, transactional feeling of a woman who needed a roof. She'd had that in the beginning, and she knew what that felt like. The particular gratitude that looks like attachment and isn't. This was different. This had grown up quietly while she wasn't watching it, the way things grow when you're busy surviving. She noticed it in the way she listened for his boots on the porch at the end of the day, in the way a room felt different when he was in it versus when he wasn't, in the specific quality of her fear during the blizzard, which had not been the fear of a woman worried about losing her shelter. She sat with that for a while. Then she thought about what it meant, practically, honestly, without the softening she sometimes applied to hard things. She was a widow with a baby and no money and no name that didn't carry damage attached to it. He was a man with land and a life and a reputation that was currently being eroded at the edges because of her presence in it. And whatever he felt, and she thought he felt something, she wasn't blind, he hadn't said it, and she wasn't going to say it first because she'd learned the cost of being the one who said things first. She got up and went back to work, because that was what there was. It was 4 days after Harlan's Crossing when Colton came in from the barn at midday, not his usual time, and sat down at the table with the look of a man who had finally located the words he'd been searching for. Evelyn was making bread. She kept her hands in the dough and waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is no." "All right." "Do you intend to stay?" "Not because you have nowhere else to go. I mean, do you want to stay?" "Here. At this ranch." She looked at him. Is that the question, or is that the preamble to the question? Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Preamble. Then ask the actual question. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. I'd like you to consider marrying me. The dough in her hands went completely still. I know that's... He stopped. Started again. I know I'm not saying this the way it's supposed to be said. I'm not a man who does things the expected way, and you probably know that by now. But I've been thinking about it since before the storm, and I thought about it the whole ride back from Harlan's Crossing, and I can't find a good reason not to say it, so I'm saying it. Evelyn stood at the kitchen counter with her hands in bread dough and looked at Colton Hayes. Why? She asked. He blinked. It was the same word she'd asked him on the road. Why? And the shape of it seemed to land the same way this time. Because I want to, he said. Because this house has been alive since you've been in it in a way it wasn't before. Because Clara needs not just shelter, she needs a situation that's stable and protected and... He stopped himself. I'm listing reasons because I'm nervous, and when I'm nervous, I make lists. The real answer is simpler. What's the real answer? I don't want you to leave. A pause. I don't want you to ever leave. And the honest way to say that in this territory, at this time, is to ask you to marry me, because that's the thing that makes it solid. Legal. Mine to defend. Yours to defend, she repeated. That came out wrong. No, she said slowly. I think it came out right. I think that's actually what you mean. He looked at her carefully. Is that a problem? She pulled her hands out of the dough and wiped them on the cloth at her waist and turned to face him properly. Colton, I've been married to a man who thought I was his to do with as he liked, and that is a very different thing from what you're describing. I know that. I'm not comparing you to Thomas, but I need to ask you something in return. Ask it? Is this because you want me or because you want to fix the situation? Because those feel similar from the inside, but they're not the same thing, and I need to know which one it is before I can answer you. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might be offended. Then he said, both. And I know that's not the romantic answer, but I'd rather be honest with you than say the prettier thing. Something in her chest, which had been braced, relaxed a fraction. Both is actually the right answer, she said. Both is the human answer. So is that a yes? It's a not yet, she said. It's a, give me until tomorrow. Let me think about it without the bread dough on my hands. He nodded. He stood up and picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the table, and he was almost to the door when she said, Colton. He turned. The fact that you asked, she said, the way you asked, honestly, without dressing it up, that matters. I want you to know that matters. He looked at her for a moment. All right, he said, and went back outside. And she stood in the kitchen with the bread dough drying on her hands and her heart doing something complicated and unfamiliar that she was going to need the rest of the day to sort out. She said yes the next morning. She told him at breakfast, just those words, yes, I'll marry you. And he looked at her across the table with an expression so briefly open that she felt she'd been handed something fragile to hold. And then he nodded once and said, all right. And they finished breakfast and he went to work. And it was the most ordinary, extraordinary thing she'd experienced in her life. That afternoon he rode to Harlan's Crossing alone. She didn't know that's where he went until he came back. She'd assumed a fence line or the south pasture. He came in at dusk and sat down and told her plainly, I went to speak to Reverend Callis. He'll marry us at the church whenever we're ready. A pause. I also went to see Walt Greer. She put down what she was holding. Why? Because Walt has been in this territory 30 years and he has a long reach, and I'd rather tell him myself than have him hear it and make something of it before I get a chance to speak. How did he take it? Colton's jaw tightened slightly. He tried to talk me out of it. Spent about 10 minutes explaining all the reasons it was a mistake, the name, the history, the council's position, Anson's opinion. And? I told him I appreciated his candor and that I'd made my decision. He looked at her. He said something I want to tell you because you should know. Tell me. He said, and I'm giving you his words, he said, when Margaret died, half this town came to that funeral because they loved her. You marry this woman and you'll be asking them to accept someone in Margaret's place, and they'll resent her for it whether she deserves it or not. The room was very quiet. Is he right? Evelyn asked. Probably, Colton said. Some of them, for a while. That doesn't bother you? It bothers me. His voice was even. It's also not enough to change my mind. She looked at him steadily. I'm not trying to take Margaret's place. I know that. I want you to know that I know who she was to you. I know this ranch was hers in some way that matters. I'm not coming in here to replace anything. I know, he said again, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something careful and genuine and a little rougher than usual. You're not replacing anything. You're something else, something different, and I think that's all right. I think Margaret would have... He stopped, looked away briefly. I think it's all right. She didn't push the rest of that sentence. It wasn't hers to finish. Then let's do it, she said, before I lose my nerve. He looked back at her with something that was, definitively, the smile she'd been watching for since the very first morning. Not large, not performed, just real, just the actual shape of his face when something reached him. You don't have a nerve to lose, he said. You'd be surprised, she said. Hold up. They set the date for the following Saturday, and on Thursday, Boyd Sutter made his second visit to the ranch. This time he came with 5 men, and this time he didn't bother with the polite fiction of a council resolution or official business. He came in the early evening when the light was going and pulled his horse up hard at the yard gate, and the men with him spread out slightly in the way of men who have been told where to stand, which told Evelyn everything about how organized this was. She was at the kitchen window again. She saw it, and she felt the cold move through her that had nothing to do with temperature. Colton was already at the door. Boyd, he said, stepping out onto the porch. Last chance, Hayes. Sutter's voice had none of the official tone from before. This was just a man who had decided. Send her away and we walk. Make this permanent, and you're going to find this territory a much harder place to operate. You threatening my water rights again? I'm not threatening anything. Sutter's jaw was rigid. I'm telling you that there are men in this county who lost real money to Thomas Mercer, real land. One man lost his house. You understand what I'm saying? He lost the house his children were born in because Thomas Mercer made him promises and took his money. And you want to put that man's wife on a respectable ranch and call her Mrs. Hayes and expect everyone to sit down and swallow it. She didn't take that man's house. She's the name. She's what's left of him. You put your name on her. You're putting your name on what he did. And this community is not going to... This community, Colton said, and his voice had dropped to the register she'd learned to pay most attention to, the very quiet one, does not get to decide what name I put on anything. This is my land. She is the woman I intend to marry. And you and these men are going to turn around and ride back to town. And if any one of you sets foot on my property again without a legal reason, I will be at the sheriff's office in the morning. Dodd won't help you, one of the other men said. Dodd's got his own opinions about... Dodd is the law, Colton said. Whatever his opinions are. And I will use the law, Boyd, every piece of it, and I will be patient about it. And you know me well enough to know I mean that. Silence. The horses moved. One of the younger men in the group was looking at the ground now. Not committed, Evelyn could see it even from the window, a man who'd come along because Sutter had asked him, and was now reconsidering the ask. You're finished in this county, Sutter said. It came out different from the earlier threats. Quieter, more personal, like something he actually believed. Maybe, Colton said. I've been finished before. I'm still here. Sutter looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned his horse and the men with him followed. And the last one, the young one who'd been looking at the ground, glanced back at the porch once with an expression Evelyn couldn't fully read. Uncertainty. Maybe something else. Colton stood on the porch until they were off the property. Then he came inside and Evelyn was standing in the kitchen doorway, and he looked at her face. I'm all right, she said, before he could ask. I know, he said. Are you still sure about Saturday? She looked at him. Are you? More than I was before they showed up, he said, which was so purely Colton that she almost laughed. Then yes, she said, I'm sure. It. Saturday came cold and clear, the kind of March morning that can't decide if it's winter still or something else beginning. Reverend Callis was a thin, quiet man who had been in Harlan's Crossing longer than anyone except Walt Greer, and who had, in Evelyn's brief meeting with him on Wednesday, looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who had seen enough of human beings to stop being surprised by them. He'd asked her 2 questions. Was this her choice freely made, and did she understand the covenant she was entering? And when she'd answered both plainly, he'd nodded and said, "Saturday, then." And that was all the ceremony needed before the ceremony. Evelyn wore the best dress she had, which was not very grand. Dark blue wool, slightly worn at the elbows, and she'd washed her hair the night before and put it up as well as she could manage, with Clara balanced on her hip. And she looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand and thought, "This is what I look like. This is who is getting married today. Not the girl who'd married Thomas Mercer at 19, hopeful and foolish, and not yet educated in the cost of hoping foolishly. Someone else, someone made of different material now, harder in the places that needed to be hard. And still, she checked for this, still soft enough in the other places that mattered. Clara was wearing the small white gown Evelyn had sewn from a piece of good linen she'd found in the bottom of the pantry, where it had apparently been sitting since Margaret Hayes's time. She'd asked Colton about it before cutting it, and he'd been quiet for a moment and then said, "Use it." She'd want it used. Evelyn had taken him at his word and made the gown, and Clara in it looked like a small, very opinionated flower, which was accurate. They drove to town in the wagon, Colton in his good coat, Evelyn with Clara in her lap. "Nervous?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "You?" "Yes." "Good," she said. "That seems right." He looked at her sideways. "Does it? If you weren't nervous, it would mean you weren't taking it seriously. I'd rather have the nervous." The corner of his mouth moved. "All right. Then I'm extremely nervous. Now you're performing it." "Little bit," he admitted. They drove the rest of the way in a comfortable quiet, broken by Clara's commentary on the passing landscape, which was extensive and entirely in a language only she understood. The church in Harlan's Crossing was a plain building, practical and unadorned, which suited the occasion more than she might have thought. She'd half expected, or maybe half feared, to walk in and find it empty, the community's opinion of her communicated in the clearest possible terms by bare pews. There were 8 people there. 8 was not a crowd, but it was not nothing either, and in the context of everything that had happened, 8 felt like a statement. Dr. Weston was there, sitting in the second pew with his hat on his knee, and he nodded at her when she came in with the specific nod of a man who has made a deliberate choice to be present. Beside him was a woman she didn't know, gray-haired, steady-faced, who turned out to be Weston's wife, Clara, which meant Evelyn's daughter was briefly sharing a name with the only woman in the church who'd come without any prior connection to either of them. There was a family from 3 miles east of the ranch, a farmer named Aldous Brenner, and his wife and their oldest daughter, who Colton had done fence-mending work with 2 winters back, a piece of mutual aid that had apparently been the foundation of a loyalty that outlasted the current social weather of the county. And there, in the very back pew, hat in hands and expression carefully neutral, was Walt Greer. Evelyn saw him when she came down the aisle, and she almost stopped walking. Colton, beside her, felt the hesitation, and his hand found her arm briefly. Not grabbing, just present. And she kept moving. Reverend Callis married them in 17 minutes, which was not short exactly, but not long either, and every word of it was the necessary word without ornamentation. When he asked if anyone present had cause to object, Evelyn heard the silence as the most important thing in the room, not because she'd been afraid of an objection, but because silence from 8 people who had chosen to be there carried a weight that words would have diluted. Colton Hayes said "I do" in the same voice he said everything, direct, without performance, and looked at her while he said it, which was the part she would remember longest. She said I do, and meant it in a way she could not have imagined meaning anything on the morning she'd sat down in the snow at the crossroads 3 months ago. Reverend Callis said, "You may," and Colton kissed her before the sentence was finished, briefly, carefully, as if he were making a promise with it rather than a demonstration, and Clara chose that exact moment to make her strongest proclamation of the morning into the quiet of the church, which broke the solemnity so completely that even Reverend Callis smiled. "She approves," Weston said from the second pew. "She approves of most things loudly," Evelyn said, which got a sound from the pews that was, unmistakably, laughter. Walt Greer came to speak to her afterward, outside the church in the cold March air, while Colton was talking with Aldous Brenner about the spring planting. She saw him coming and held her ground. He stopped a few feet away and looked at her, really looked at her, the way she'd noticed people rarely did, the looking that was actually seeing. And then he took his hat off, which she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Hayes," he said. The name landed differently than she anticipated. "I won't pretend I've been generous to you in my thinking." "No," she agreed. "You haven't." "Ruth spoke to me." He turned the hat in his hands. "Several times, if I'm being straight. She said I was judging you by the name instead of the person, and that I'd have said the same about her own sister if she'd married wrong, and that it was a small and cowardly kind of judgment." A pause. "Ruth is usually right about those things. It takes me a while to catch up." Evelyn looked at him. This man who had the longest reach in the county and had been using it against her for 2 months. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. The speech was too honest and too uncomfortable for that. Too much the speech of a man reporting his own failure rather than requesting absolution for it. "What do you want from me, Mr. Greer?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "I came to tell you I was wrong about the way I handled this, and that I'll say the same to Colton, and that whatever influence I have in this county won't be working against you anymore." He put his hat back on. "What it'll do going forward, I don't know. Boyd Sutter's not mine to control. Anson has his own views, but I won't be adding to it." She studied him for a moment. "That's more than I expected from you." "It's less than you deserved from the start," he said, which surprised her into silence. "I hope you'll both do well here. I mean that." He walked away, and she watched him go, and she thought about Ruth Greer, who had come to the ranch that winter day with her armored pity and said, "You've got spine," and apparently gone home and spent the next 2 months working on her husband about it. There were unlikely allies in the most unpromising places sometimes. You couldn't always predict them. You just had to stay long enough for them to arrive. The trouble, when it came, arrived 2 weeks after the wedding, and it came not from Sutter this time, but from a direction she hadn't been watching. It came from a man named Harlan Pruitt, no relation to the town's founding family, despite the shared name, who had apparently lost cattle in a deal Thomas Mercer had brokered 4 years ago, a deal in which Thomas had acted as intermediary and then disappeared with the fee without completing his end. Pruitt had spent 4 years with a specific, focused anger about this, and he'd heard about the wedding in Harlan's Crossing the way news traveled in the territory, and he'd ridden 3 days to say something about it in person. She was alone at the ranch when he arrived. Colton was out at the south pasture with the early calving. Pruitt was not a large man, but he was the kind of man whose anger had compacted him over years into something dense and difficult. He tied his horse at the fence and walked to the door and knocked with a closed fist rather than knuckles. And when Evelyn opened it, he said without preamble, "You're the Mercer woman." "I'm Evelyn Hayes," she said. "Can I help you?" His eyes moved past her into the house with the look of a man taking inventory. "He took 40 head from me," Pruitt said. "Your husband, Thomas Mercer. 40 head and $300 in cash. You know anything about that?" "I know Thomas did a great deal of damage to a great many people," she said. "I'm sorry you were one of them." "Sorry." He said the word the way people said a word that has worn out its meaning. "I had to sell my property, Mrs. Hayes. I had to take my family to my wife's brother's place and work his land because what I had was gone. You understand what that's like?" "I understand what it is to have someone take everything and leave," she said carefully. "Yes." His eyes came back to her face. He was looking for something. Contempt, maybe, or evasion, or the particular blankness of a person who's been pretending not to know things. He didn't find any of those. He never told you, Pruitt said. It wasn't quite a question. Not the details. I knew the shape of it. I didn't know the specifics because he kept things from me. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you to feel sorry for me. I'm not using that as an excuse. I'm just telling you what's true. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them. The man who married you, he said finally. Hayes. He know the full of it? What Mercer did? Yes, she said. He knows. And he married you anyway. And he married me anyway. Pruitt looked at her. Then he looked at the house, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not forgiveness, not that. She wasn't going to make it that simple. But something. The particular deflation of a man who arrived ready to fight and found no one fighting back. I rode 3 days, he said, and now he just sounded tired. I know, she said. Come in and have something to eat before you ride back. He stared at her. Are you serious? You're hungry, and you rode 3 days. That's separate from everything else. He came in. He ate. He sat at the kitchen table where Colton Hayes had sat on the first night and where Evelyn had eaten every meal since, and Clara sat in her crate in the corner and watched him with enormous solemn eyes, and he looked at Clara the way people who had lost things looked at children, with the specific tenderness of someone who knows exactly what they're worth. Colton came in from the pasture while Pruitt was still there, and the moment had a tension that didn't explode but simply sat there between the three of them while introductions were made. Then Colton sat down and poured coffee and looked at Pruitt and said, Tell me about the cattle. How many? What breed? When? Pruitt blinked. Why? Because I want to understand what happened, the actual transaction. You can't give them back. No, but I'd like to understand it. And Harlan Pruitt, who had ridden 3 days with his compacted anger to find someone to blame for a loss that was already years old, sat in the kitchen of Colton and Evelyn Hayes and told them what had happened, in the level, exhausted voice of a man who has held a story so long it has become part of his skeleton. And Colton listened the way he listened to everything, completely, without preparing his response, and Evelyn poured more coffee and didn't say anything unnecessary. At the end, Pruitt sat back and looked at the table. I don't know what I came here to get, he said. You came here to be heard, Evelyn said. Most people do. He looked at her. Then, with the awkward deliberateness of a man who doesn't do this often, I'm sorry for the trouble he caused you as well. Thank you, she said. I mean that. Pruitt stayed the night. They gave him the lean-to that served as a guest room, such as it was, and left the next morning. He didn't shake Colton's hand when he left, and Evelyn didn't expect him to, because some distance is close partway and stopped there, and that was honest, and she preferred honest to performed. She stood in the yard watching him ride away, and Colton stood beside her. That was something, he said. He needed to say it to someone who knew Thomas, she said, someone who couldn't excuse it. I couldn't excuse it, and I didn't, and I think that helped. You fed him dinner. He was hungry. Colton looked at her. You're a remarkable person, he said. I want you to know I know that. She looked back at him, at this man who was her husband now. That word still sat new and strange and not unwelcome in her mind. I'm not remarkable, she said. I'm just stubborn. Margaret used to say stubbornness was the only virtue that held up under pressure, he said. Margaret sounds like she was right about most things. She was, he said, simply, without pain, or rather, with a pain that had been lived with long enough to become something that could be held without dropping. You two I think you'd have liked each other. She thought about that. I think I'd have liked her too, she said. They stood in the yard in the March morning, not touching, not needing to, and the ranch was around them with its fences and its barn and its history of loss and its present of something else entirely. And Clara's voice came from inside the house, that particular demanding sound that meant she'd woken from her nap and had opinions about being left alone. And Evelyn turned to go inside and felt Colton's hand briefly at the small of her back, just present, just there. And she thought, this is what solid feels like. Not perfect, not resolved, not finished. There was still Sutter and still Anson, and still the long work of being accepted in a territory that had decided about her before she arrived. There were still nights she'd wake with the weight of Thomas's damage pressing on her chest. There were still mornings Colton would stand at the window too long with his coffee gone cold, looking at nothing she could see. But solid. Built on something real. She went inside to her daughter, and her husband came in behind her, and the house was warm, and outside the March sky was doing what it always did eventually. It was beginning to clear. Part 5. A new legacy begins. Spring came to the Hayes Ranch the way it always came to that part of the territory. Not all at once, not with any particular announcement, but incrementally, the way trust comes, the way most real things come. A degree warmer. Another inch of mud at the barn door. The sound of water moving under ice that was finally thin enough to hear through. Evelyn noticed it first in the light. The kitchen window that had been dark by 4 in the afternoon was suddenly holding light past 5 and then past 6, and she found herself standing at that window more often than she used to, not watching for trouble, which had been her habit all winter, but just watching. The way the late light moved across the yard. The way the bare trees at the fence line were starting to show something at the tips of their branches, a faint green suggestion, not yet a promise, but close. Clara had learned to pull herself upright by gripping the slats of her crate, and she did this approximately 40 times a day now, hauling herself up with an expression of fierce concentration and then standing there swaying with the profound satisfaction of someone who has solved a problem. Colton had watched this process with the attentiveness of a man who understood that something important was happening, even if it looked like a small thing, and one morning he'd come in from the barn to find Clara standing at the crate rail, swaying, and he'd crouched down at her level and held out his finger, and she'd looked at it and then grabbed it with both hands and let go of the rail entirely, trusting his hand the way she trusted everything, completely, without evidence, on faith that the world would hold her. Evelyn had watched from the kitchen doorway and said nothing. Later that evening, when Clara was asleep, she said, "She's going to walk soon." "Week or 2, maybe," Colton said. He was reading, or trying to. He'd read the same page twice, she'd noticed. "She grabbed your finger today like it was the most natural thing." He looked up. "She knows what's steady." It was the kind of thing he said sometimes, simple and precise and more than it looked, and she'd learned not to rush past those things. "Yes," she said. "She does." Boyd Sutter made one final attempt in April. She'd almost stopped expecting it. 4 weeks of relative quiet had lulled her into a cautious normality. Not complacency, she wasn't capable of complacency anymore, but something approaching ordinary daily life, which was its own kind of miracle after the winter they'd had. And then on a Tuesday morning, Colton came in from Harlan's Crossing. With a set to his jaw she recognized, and a piece of paper he set on the table in front of her. "Sutter filed a complaint with Judge Anson," he said, "claiming that a woman of disreputable character has obtained legal standing in this county through marriage, and that the court should review the validity of that marriage on grounds of—" He paused. "On grounds of the groom being under undue influence." Evelyn stared at the paper. Undue influence. "His claim is that you used the death of my wife and son, my grief, essentially, to manipulate me into marriage." The coldness that moved through her was different from the cold of the winter road. It was the cold of something calculated, something that had taken the most private and painful thing in their shared life and turned it into a legal instrument. "Can he do that?" she asked. "He can file it. Whether Anson takes it seriously is another question." Colton sat down. His hands were flat on the table in the way they got when he was working to stay level. "Anson has never liked me. We've had disagreements going back 10 years over water, over land use, over the way he runs his court. This gives him an opportunity dressed up as principal." "What do we do?" "We go to the hearing." He looked at her. "And we tell the truth, which is all we've ever done." She looked at him across the table. At the man who had, in the past 4 months, stood in his yard against Sutter's men, ridden through a blizzard, stood in the middle of a street and said things that cost him, married her in front of 8 people in a half-empty church, and fed a man who'd come to his house full of justified anger and given him a place to sleep. "I'm sorry this keeps coming back at you," she said. "It's not coming back at me," he said. "It's coming back at us. There's a difference." She picked up the paper and read it through. It was the language of legal complaint. Dry, precise, carefully chosen. But underneath the language, she could see the shape of Sutter's thinking, and it was the thinking of a man who had run out of direct methods and was now trying the indirect ones, which was sometimes a sign of desperation and sometimes a sign of patience, and she wasn't sure yet which this was. "I want to talk to Walt Greer," she said. Colton looked at her. "Why?" "Because he told me his influence wouldn't work against us anymore. I want to see if that was true or if it was something he said because it was Saturday and he was in a generous mood." A beat. Yes, that's a good idea. I'll go myself." "Evelyn, he needs to see me come to him," she said. "Not us, me. If I send you, it looks like I'm hiding behind you. I've been hiding behind things my whole life. I'm done with it." He looked at her for a long moment with those steady gray eyes. Then, "All right." She rode to Harlan's Crossing the next morning on the bay horse, which she'd gotten comfortable with over the winter, and she tied him at the rail outside Greer's feed store and went in and found Walt Greer doing inventory in the back. And she said, "I need to talk to you about Sutter's complaint." And he put down his ledger and said, "I heard about it yesterday. Sit down." She sat. "It's Anson I'm worried about," she said. "Not Sutter. Sutter does what he does out of wounded pride and borrowed grievance, and I understand that even if I don't like it. Anson is different." "Anson," Walt said with the careful tone of a man discussing someone powerful in a public place, "has a particular vision of how this territory should order itself. He's not a cruel man. He genuinely believes the things he believes. That makes him more dangerous than Sutter, not less." "Can you speak to him?" Walt was quiet for a moment. "Harold Anson and I have known each other for 22 years. We don't agree on everything, but he respects the fact that I say what I mean." He looked at her. "I'll speak to him. I'll tell him what I know about you, which is limited but firsthand, and I'll tell him that the complaint Sutter filed is personal grievance wearing a legal hat." A pause. "I can't promise it'll change his mind." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for the attempt." Walt Greer looked at her across the counter with the expression she'd seen on him for the first time outside the church after the wedding. The expression of a man who had updated his assessment and was still a little surprised by what it now said. "You know what Margaret Hayes had?" he said. "The quality I admired most in her?" She waited. "She never asked anyone to believe something she wouldn't put her own name behind," he said. "She didn't ask people to take things on faith. She asked them to look at what was true." He picked his ledger back up. "You do that too. I don't know if you got it from somewhere or whether life just worked it into you, but you do it." She stood up. "Thank you, Walt." "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Come back after the hearing." The hearing was set for the second Thursday of April. The night before, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark beside Colton. They'd moved into the main bedroom in March, the room that had been his and Margaret's, which she'd approached with care, and he'd offered with the same quality of deliberateness he brought to everything. And she listened to his breathing and stared at the ceiling and let her mind run through all the ways it could go wrong. Anson could find for Sutter, could declare the marriage invalid on whatever grounds Sutter's lawyers had constructed, could strip her of the legal standing that was, at this point, the difference between being Evelyn Hayes on a ranch she had helped build and being Evelyn Mercer with nowhere left to go. She thought about that, about nowhere left to go, about what that had felt like 5 months ago at the crossroads, and she did something she hadn't done in years. She measured the distance between that moment and this one, not in miles or months, but in substance, in the specific weight of what she now had that she hadn't had then. She had Clara, who was almost walking. She had a kitchen she'd made into something, a pantry with a system, a curtain she'd put back up herself, a new one, blue-checked, not the color of old bone. She had a man beside her in the dark who breathed steadily because he'd decided to trust that tomorrow would be manageable, and who had somehow, without either of them planning it, become the most reliable thing she'd ever leaned against. She had herself, which she'd always had, but which she understood differently now, not as a liability to be managed, not as the widow of a bad man, not as someone too marked by damage to be worth defending, just herself, a woman who had sat down in the snow and gotten back up. Anson could take the legal standing. He couldn't take any of that. She fell asleep somewhere around 2 in the morning, which was late, but not as late as she'd expected. The courthouse in Harlan's Crossing was the most official-looking building in the county, which wasn't saying much. It was just the feed stores equal in size, but with a flag outside and benches inside instead of grain sacks. Judge Anson sat at the bench like a man who had been born to elevated surfaces, a small, precise, white-haired man who wore his authority the way some men wore good coats, not as a performance, but as a settled fact about themselves. The room was not empty. That was the first thing she noticed. She didn't know what she'd expected. The 8 people from the church wedding, maybe, or fewer. But the benches held more than that. Dr. Weston and his wife in the second row, Aldous Brenner, the farmer, with his wife beside him, and Harlan Pruitt. Harlan Pruitt, who had ridden 3 days to find someone to blame and had eaten dinner at her table and left the next morning without shaking Colton's hand, but without hatred either. Sitting alone in the back row with his hat on his knee and an expression of someone who had decided, privately and without fanfare, that there was one more thing he needed to do about the Thomas Mercer business before he could put it down. Walt Greer was there, not testifying, just present, sitting at the end of a row with the composure of a man who has said the thing he came to say to the right person and is now waiting to see if it held. Boyd Sutter sat on the claimant's side with a man Evelyn didn't recognize who was apparently the attorney he'd brought from the county seat, and Sutter had the look of a man who had spent 4 months on this and fully expected it to pay off today. Anson called the proceeding to order. The attorney laid out Sutter's complaint. She sat through it with her hands folded in her lap, and her face arranged in the stillness she'd learned the hard way, because showing Sutter's attorney that his words were landing gave them more power than they deserved. The claim was what Colton had described: undue influence, exploitation of grief, a vulnerable widower manipulated by a woman with a compromised history into a marriage that served her interests and damaged the community's. When it was done, Anson looked at Colton. "Mr. Hayes, do you wish to speak to the matter of your own mental state at the time of this marriage?" Colton stood. He was not a man who used more space than he needed, but standing in that room he filled it the way a solid thing fills space. Not imposingly, just completely. "Judge Anson," he said, "I lost my wife and my son 3 years ago. I understand that Sutter's complaint relies on the claim that I was too diminished by that loss to make a sound decision in February of this year. I want to address that claim directly." Anson nodded. "I was diminished," Colton said. "I won't say otherwise. Anyone who loses what I lost is diminished by it in ways that don't entirely repair. But diminished is not the same as incapable. I ran this ranch for 3 years after Margaret died. I managed the water rights, the cattle, the accounts, the contracts. Nobody filed a claim questioning my judgment on any of those decisions." The room was very quiet. "The decision to marry Evelyn Mercer was the clearest decision I've made in 3 years, he said. "Not because I was dazzled by something or because I wasn't thinking straight, because I was thinking straighter than I had in a long time, which is what happens when you've been alone long enough to know what you actually want versus what's convenient." He looked at Anson without flinching. "She didn't exploit my grief. She respected it. There's a difference, and I know the difference because I've experienced both." Silence. Anson made a note. "Mrs. Hayes, do you wish to speak?" She stood. She'd thought about what she would say. She'd thought about it for a week, arranged it, organized it, and then the night before she'd set all of it aside because organized arguments had their place, and this was not that place. "I came to this territory in December with 47 cents and a 7-month-old baby," she said. "My husband was dead and every town I'd passed through had sent me away, and I sat down in the snow on a road 8 miles from here because I couldn't walk anymore." She paused. "Mr. Hayes found me on that road. He took me to his ranch. He fed me and gave me a room and a job, and when this town decided to have opinions about that, he stood in his yard and said she stays. He rode through a blizzard when my daughter was sick. He stood in the middle of a street and said things about my right to be here that cost him, because that's who he is." She looked at Anson directly. "I didn't exploit that man's grief. I shared mine with him. We built something together out of what we both had left, which wasn't much to start with on either side. And if the court decides that's not enough, that the history attached to my name is enough to undo a marriage made by two adults in full possession of their judgment, then I want that decision to be made out loud, in this room, with everyone here to hear exactly what it means. She sat down. The room was so quiet she could hear Clara, who was with Weston's wife in the back, and was beginning to have opinions about the proceedings. Anson looked at his notes for a long moment. Then Harlan Pruitt stood up from the back bench without being invited to, without legal standing to do so, and said, "Your Honor, I've got something to say if you'll let me." Anson looked at him over his glasses. "And you are?" "Harlan Pruitt. Thomas Mercer took 40 head and $300 from me 4 years ago. I'm probably the man in this territory with the most personal grievance against the Mercer name." Sutter shifted on his bench. "I rode to the Hayes Ranch 6 weeks ago," Pruitt continued, "with the intention of saying some hard things to that woman. Instead, she fed me dinner and gave me a place to sleep and sat with me while I told the whole story of what happened. And she didn't make excuses, and she didn't look away. And when I left lighter than I'd been in 4 years." He looked at Sutter with an expression that was not warm. "Boyd Sutter has never lost anything to Thomas Mercer. He's doing this for his own reasons, and I think the court should know that those of us who actually have a grievance don't support this complaint." He sat back down. The room exhaled. Anson looked at his papers for a full minute. Then he took his glasses off and set them on the bench and said, "Mr. Sutter's complaint relies on a characterization of Mrs. Hayes that is contradicted by the direct testimony of the man who married her, the man with the most evident material grievance against her late husband, and the observable fact of this community's partial presence here today." He paused. "The complaint is dismissed." Sutter's attorney began to say something, and Anson looked at him with the calm finality of a man who has made up his mind and filed the decision and is already thinking about the next matter, and the attorney stopped. Outside the courthouse, in the April air that smelled for the first time this season like something growing rather than something frozen, Evelyn stood on the steps with Colton beside her and felt the particular silence of something being over. Not everything. Not the long work of being in a territory that had decided about her and would take years to finish revising that decision. Not the occasional hard look in the feed store or the conversation that stopped when she entered a room. Not Boyd Sutter, who she suspected would take his losses and repackage them and try something else eventually, because some men were constructed that way and didn't know how to stop. But this particular battle, this specific piece of the long fight, over. "Pruitt," she said. Colton looked across the street to where Pruitt was untying his horse. "Yeah, I didn't expect that." "I did," Colton said. "A little." She looked at him. "You knew he'd come?" "I didn't know. I thought he might. He's a man who knows what's right even when it's inconvenient for him to do it. Those men usually show up." She watched Pruitt mount his horse. He caught her eye across the distance and nodded. Just once, brief, the nod of a man finishing something, and she nodded back. "Thank you," she called across the street. He raised one hand without looking back and rode west, and she thought about the strange economics of this. How the man who had every reason to be her enemy had ended up being the voice that mattered most in that room, and how that wasn't grace exactly. It was just what happened sometimes when you fed someone dinner and didn't make them feel like a problem. Summer came in slowly and then all at once, the way summers do in that territory, and the ranch in July looked different than it had in December. Not transformed, it was still practical, still all right angles and function over form, but alive in a way it hadn't been when Evelyn had first walked into it. There were things growing in the kitchen garden she'd put in along the south fence. The barn had been reorganized, Colton's domain, done in the methodical way he did everything, and the east pasture, which had been losing ground to encroaching scrub, was being worked back by increments. Clara walked. She did it on a Tuesday in June, in the kitchen, unannounced. She let go of the crate rail and took 3 steps toward Colton, who was sitting at the table with his coffee, and arrived at his knee and grabbed it, and looked up at him with the expression of someone who has just done something impossible and knows it. "Did you see that?" Colton said. His voice was strange. "I saw it," Evelyn said from the stove. He looked down at Clara, who was already looking back at the middle of the room with the expression of someone calculating the next attempt. He put his coffee down and held out his hands. "Come on then," he said. "Let's see it again." Clara walked to him again, then back to Evelyn, then across the kitchen in a slightly different direction, testing the proposition from multiple angles, as she tested most things, thoroughly, without assumption. Evelyn stood at the stove and watched her daughter walk back and forth between herself and Colton Hayes, and she felt something she would have difficulty explaining later if asked. Something that wasn't quite joy, because it was too specific for that, too tied to this kitchen, and this man, and this child, and this particular morning that was unremarkable in every way, except that it was completely her life, and she had not expected, at the crossroads in December, to have a life at all. "She looks like you when she does that," Colton said, watching Clara navigate the kitchen with magnificent seriousness. "Does she?" "The expression, the one that says she's figured something out and she's checking her work." Evelyn looked at Clara. "Thought about that." "That's not a compliment," she said. "Yes, it is," he said. Colton told her about Margaret on a July evening, sitting on the porch after Clara was in bed, the first time he'd talked about her fully. Not in pieces, not the careful excerpts he'd offered over the winter, but the whole shape of it, the whole person. What she'd been like in the morning before she'd had coffee, which was apparently formidable. The argument they'd had about the kitchen curtain, which had been going on for 2 years, and which Margaret had been right about, and which he hadn't admitted while she was alive. The way she'd talked to Daniel, his name easier in Colton's mouth now than it had been in December, still weighted, but no longer unmanageable. The way she'd started every day by going outside for 5 minutes, regardless of the weather, because she said it oriented her, reminded her what was real. Evelyn listened to all of it. She asked questions when she had them and didn't when she didn't, and she understood that this was a thing he'd been holding for 3 years that needed to be said to someone who would hold it carefully, and she tried to do that. "I don't talk about them to keep them alive," he said at the end. "They're not alive, I know that." "Then why?" "Because they were real," he said, "and real things deserve to be remembered by someone who knew them." She sat with that for a moment. "I'll remember them," she said, "for what that's worth, from what you've told me." He looked at her. "It's worth something," he said. "More than you'd think." The night was warm and the stars were out in the particular density that the territory offered on clear July nights, extravagant, showing off. A sound came from somewhere in the dark pasture, one of the horses, moving slow, unbothered. "I have something to tell you," she said. He waited. "I'm expecting." The silence that followed was not the silence of shock or the silence of a man who needed time to understand what he'd been told. It was more like the silence after something important and inevitable has been said aloud, and the world is adjusting to having it in the air. "When?" he said. "January, maybe. February." He was quiet for another moment. Then he reached over and took her hand, which he didn't do often. Not because he was distant, but because he was careful. Because he understood that gestures meant more when they weren't deployed casually, and held it without saying anything, and she felt the warmth of that, the specific warmth of a hand that was choosing to be there. "January," he said finally. "When I found you in December, you'd been on that road for 4 hours." "Yes." "And a year later." "A year later," she agreed. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the particular acknowledgement of someone who has looked directly at something and found it almost too large to see clearly. "All right," he said. "All right?" "I'm glad," he said. "I wanted to say something more than that, something—" "All right is fine," she said. "All right is exactly right." The September council meeting in Harlan's Crossing was the first one Evelyn attended, and she attended it because Walt Greer had asked her to, which was not something she'd expected to happen. The issue on the table was a school. The territory had grown enough families, enough children, enough future pressing at the edges of the present, to justify a schoolhouse, and the question of where and how and who would teach had been the primary occupation of the council for 2 months. Walt had floated the suggestion that Evelyn Hayes might be willing to teach, which had caused the predictable argument, and he'd told her about it in the feed store one afternoon and said, "I think if you came and said your piece, it would help." "Or it would make it worse," she'd said. "Maybe," he'd agreed, "but I've noticed that things have generally gone better when you speak for yourself than when I speak for you, and I've tried both." She came to the meeting. She sat in the third row and listened to the council discuss the school with the particular quality of people who were mostly agreed but hadn't figured out how to stop arguing yet. And when there was a pause, she stood up and said, "I can teach. I was schooled through the age of 16 in Missouri, and I've kept up my reading since. I know arithmetic and history and geography and grammar, and I know how to explain things to people who don't yet understand them." She paused. "I'm also going to have a child in January, which means I'll need to manage that, and I'm telling you up front because I'd rather you know it and decide than not know it and be surprised." Pete Harlan, who had voted no at the water rights hearing and had not spoken to her directly at any point in the past 9 months, said from the second row, "How far along?" 7 months. He looked at her for a moment. "Could teach through November, start again in March?" "Yes." He nodded, slowly, the nod of a man recalculating. "That's workable." It wasn't warmth, it wasn't absolution. It was Pete Harlan looking at a practical problem and finding a practical solution, which meant looking past what he'd decided about her and seeing the actual person with the actual offer, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, a great deal, coming from Pete Harlan. The council voted 5-1 in favor. Boyd Sutter, who was the one, didn't look at her when he voted, which she took as a sign that the fight had mostly left him, or at least that he'd run out of new angles. She taught from October through the middle of November. 11 children in the building Aldous Brenner and 3 other men had put up on the north edge of town in 6 weeks of shared labor. The children ranged from 6 to 13 and had the mixed ability quality of children who'd been schooled irregularly or not at all, which meant the teaching was genuinely difficult and genuinely interesting, which she hadn't expected to be the same thing. The youngest student was a girl named Ida, 6 years old, who arrived the first day unable to read a single letter and was by mid-November sounding out short words with the focused intensity of someone cracking a code. Evelyn taught her the way she'd approach any hard thing, patiently, without making her feel the difficulty, going back to the beginning as many times as necessary without marking each return as a failure. One afternoon, Ida read a 3-word sentence aloud. The cat sat, and then looked up at Evelyn with an expression of such absolute radiant astonishment at her own capability that Evelyn had to look away to the window until she was sure her face was under control. She told Colton about it at dinner. 3 words, she said. She looked at me like she'd found a door she didn't know was there. "That's what it is," he said. "Reading. That's exactly what it is." "You like that," she said. "That I'm teaching." "I like that you found something that's yours," he said. "Not mine, not Clara's. Yours." She thought about that, about the difference between a life that was organized around surviving and a life that had room in it for things that were yours, about how long it had taken her to understand that those were different things and how much it had cost to learn it. "I used to think," she said, "that wanting things for myself that it was dangerous, that it attracted trouble." Thomas taught you that. Thomas, and before Thomas, just the general lesson that women in my position got taught. Keep your head down. Don't want too much. Be grateful for what you have. And now? She looked at him across the table, at this man who had ridden through a blizzard and stood in a street and said, "She stays, and she's the woman I've chosen, and all right." When she'd told him about the baby, who had told her about Margaret and Daniel and trusted her to hold it carefully, who had never once, not once, made her feel that wanting things for herself was a problem he needed to solve. "Now I think wanting things is just being alive," she said, "and that I was alive the whole time. I just didn't have anywhere safe to put it." He reached across the table and touched her hand briefly, the way he did things, without ceremony, just present. "You've got somewhere now," he said. The baby came in late January, on a night that was cold but not the punishing cold of the previous winter. A softer cold, the cold of a season that was already thinking about ending. A boy, which neither of them had predicted or planned for, which was true of most of the things that mattered. Dr. Weston came out from Harlan's Crossing without being asked urgently. Colton had ridden for him in the afternoon when it was clear the time was close, and this time the ride was through manageable cold on dry roads, which Colton noted to Evelyn afterward with the understated manner of a man acknowledging that some things go better than they did before. She named him James. James Thomas Hayes, the Thomas. For a reason she explained to Colton carefully, not to honor Thomas Mercer, but to make it something else. To take a name that had caused damage and give it a different history going forward, the way you might repair a broken fence post. You don't throw it away if the wood is still good, you fix it so it can hold something. Colton had been quiet for a long moment after she explained it. Then he said, "That's either the bravest thing I've ever heard or the most stubborn." "Can it be both?" "With you," he said, "yes, but." Clara was walking steadily by then, and she inspected James with the proprietary authority of a child who had been the only child and was adjusting to new information. She sat beside him on the bed and looked at him with enormous dark eyes, and then looked at Evelyn and said, her first clear sentence, assembled from the words she'd been collecting for months, "He's very small." "He is," Evelyn said. "I was small," Clara said, with the philosophical air of someone acknowledging a past condition they've thoroughly outgrown. "You were," Evelyn confirmed. "I got bigger," Clara said, which seemed to satisfy her as a reassurance to the new situation, and she patted James's head with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been told gently often enough to have internalized it, and then went to find Colton to report the findings. Evelyn lay in the bed with James in her arms and listened to Clara's feet in the hallway, and then Clara's voice, and then Colton's lower register answering, and then footsteps, both sets, the small rapid ones and the slow deliberate ones, coming back toward the bedroom, and then Colton appeared in the doorway with Clara on his hip, and he looked at his wife and his son with the expression she'd been watching develop on his face across a year and a winter, and a court hearing and a school and a July evening on the porch. It was the expression of a man who has found, after a long time in the cold, a fire he's allowed to stand close to. "How are you?" he asked. "Tired," she said. "Good. Tired and good." "He's small," Clara reported, helpfully, from his hip. "He'll get bigger," Colton told her. "That's what I said," Clara said. Evelyn looked at the three of them in the doorway, her daughter, who had survived the cold and the blizzard and the fever with the stubbornness of someone who'd inherited it. This man, who had crouched in the snow on a road and asked if she could stand and had been asking variations of that question ever since. And James, new and small and entirely unprepared for the world he'd arrived in, which was fine because the world he'd arrived in was prepared for him in ways it hadn't been for either of his parents. "Come in," she said. "Stop standing in the doorway." Colton came in and sat on the edge of the bed, and Clara climbed from his hip to the bed with the confident athleticism of a 1-year-old who has no concept of heights, and Evelyn shifted James, and they sat there together in the January bedroom with the cold outside and the lamp lit and the fire going in the stove, and it was not a perfect scene. Clara was demanding to hold the baby and being firmly redirected. James was beginning to have opinions about being awake, and Evelyn's back hurt in a way that was going to require several days of attention. But it was real. Completely, fully, irreducibly real. The kind of real you build not by finding the right circumstances, but by staying in the wrong ones long enough to change them. She had sat down in the snow at a crossroads a year ago and waited for whatever happened next. What happened next had been Colton Hayes and a crate by the stove and a curtain that needed to come down and a blizzard, and a courtroom, and a school with 11 children and a girl named Ida learning that letters meant doors. What happened next had been this. She looked at her husband and thought, I would make every one of those choices again. Every freezing, terrifying, uncertain one of them. Not because it had been easy, because it had been worth it. And there was, in the end, no better thing you could say about a life than that. That when you stood at the end of the road, you'd walked and turned around to look at it, what you saw was worth every step. Even the ones you'd taken in the snow, with nowhere left to go, before someone came along and said, "Then you have me."